What's up, Agent Smith?
Hello?
Hey, dude. How's it going?
Hey, how are you doing?
Pretty solid. It's been an awesome week in terms of the streaming business. And you already have, I think, 65 earned, and you haven't even started yet, so good
Oh,
job,
wow.
dude.
Generous people.
Yep.
Uh,
So I
I've
read.
been...
You go ahead, you've been proofreading.
Yeah. How did you guess?
I'm a good guesser. That's actually why I'm Grandmaster at StarCraft. I'm not smart, I'm just a really good guesser, and I guess right a lot of the time.
Well, I was just gonna say I've been proofreading hard all week because I've had a client with a dissertation I've been having to work almost full time on, so I'm a little light on current events this week as a result.
Hmm. Well, I did read a couple of the articles that you posted to Facebook. There was one on Nigeria that I thought was pretty interesting that talked about Nigeria getting its independence in the 60s. The visionary leader who was all hyped up about how now that Nigeria is unchained, it's going to zoom forward and be a world leader. But then he was very quickly killed after saying that. So it's kind of like
Yeah.
Nigeria recently had what is it? A new candidate win. The incumbent did not win, so the challenger won,
Hmm.
and that kind of opens up a new bag of issues when you're moving from an opposition party and candidate to a governing one, as we have in the U.S.
Hmm.
and just kind of the difficulties that that brings. So, what about Nigeria? What's going on? What's some more about that?
Well, it's even more complicated than that as far as the transition of power, because the guy who beat the incumbent had actually been the head of a military junta that had ruled Nigeria for a while in, I think, the late 80s, early 90s, something
Mm.
around there. And so it was a little unsettling for some people outside Nigeria concerned about the state of Nigerian democracy to see a former general like that be elected in, but he's been pretty well behaved. So there doesn't seem to be too much of a problem there. Little bit of trivia: the guy he replaced, the incumbent, was a guy named Good Luck Jonathan, which I always love. That's a very memorable name for a president.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, they're all pretty corrupt, so there hasn't been a lot of change there. Institutionally, Nigerian government has been pretty weak since independence, and there hasn't been a whole lot of traction there. Uh, as far as the economy goes, it's been growing at a pretty crisp pace, but I don't know that it's outstripping population growth that much. So it's kind of an even, it kind of negates each other basically. If your population growth is exactly equal to your economic growth, you're not really making a lot of any headway in terms of growing your GDP per capita, which is what you have to do to improve standards of living, quality of life, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So not a whole lot of progress there either. There is, I think, even in the article they mentioned that there's what do they call it, a demographic dividend, where you have a large number of basically a youth bulge in your demographic pyramid, and demographics plays a big role in driving economic growth. So there is some extra growth you get just from having a lot of young people, but the trouble Nigeria has is that there's not a lot for them to do. There's not a lot of demand for all that excess labor, and so as a result, you have so much extra labor that they can't get very good wages. And so that ends up being a drag on the economy, because then other parts of the economy, the government, etc., have to kind of prop those people up and
Mm-hmm.
help them out. There's also the massive urbanization that's occurring. Lagos, the biggest city in Nigeria, is just growing out of control. Just a titanic urban problem. I don't envy the urban planners they have over there. So a lot of problems being generated by massive population growth and a lack of corresponding economic growth to absorb it with. They do have a lot of oil in Nigeria. That makes up a good chunk of the government's revenue, but a fair amount of that is lost to corruption. So the public doesn't really get to see any of those royalties that come from that oil revenue. And there's also a good amount of piracy in the Niger Delta. The Niger is a major river running through Nigeria, and it's also the reason that Nigeria's population is so massive. Most African countries around Nigeria have populations around maybe 10 million or so, but Nigeria has a population, I think, almost 200 million, which is just orders of magnitude larger, and it speaks to the productivity and the fertility of the land around that Niger River basin.
Yep.
So along the Niger River Delta, where a lot of the oil is, there's a lot of piracy, and so that kind of bleeds out a lot of oil revenue in and of itself, and actually helped fund a revolution, or rather a rebel group. I don't remember what it was called, but they fought briefly against the Nigerian government. Not to great effect. It wasn't like the Biafran separatists. They were more just about the money, so they kind of came and went depending on how high the price of oil was and how much support they could get from local communities, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a pretty iconic picture in the article of a bunch of young Nigerian men on motorcycles in the middle of what I would guess is supposed to be a road or thoroughfare of some kind, but it was just a big muddy puddle. So it seems like they're not quite up to speed with the infrastructure of their country. In terms of African countries, they seem to be a leading nation, but they still have a lot of that kind of post-colonial corruption that they have to still throw off. So they went from, as they put it, being kind of chained by European colonialism to being chained by some of their own corrupt leaders and trying to kind of get up to speed with the other big countries in the world.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The infrastructure definitely lags behind what it could be, lags behind its potential, and the government lacks the discipline and focus to kind of deal with that. Part of the problem is that after African nations became independent, a lot of the new leaders in those countries did not feel any particular obligation to run the countries much differently than the previous colonial administrations had. And that worked out great for them because they could bleed the country dry just as much as the Europeans had before and enrich themselves. It's a very appealing prospect, apparently, given the history of the region. There have been some good apples, too. There have been some good leaders in Africa's history, but for the most part, they haven't been able to do enough to kind of stem the tide of corruption and overturn the legacy of colonialism, which, of course, has left a large footprint in Africa. Yeah, I can't comment too much on Africa because I've never been like an Africa student. I haven't studied the continent, I should say, all that much, so I don't have a whole lot to say about it. This is just kind of what I'm remembering off the top of my head and what little I have read. Fortunately, there's a question, so I don't have to think too much about it. I would like to know general thoughts about the Catalonian referendum. Yeah, this again. We did talk about this a bit last week. Basically, neither the Spanish government or the Catalan separatists really have the moral high ground here, because neither of them is really taking a very tactful or strategic approach to the issue. The Spanish government, for its part, is mostly just taking a very hard-nosed position that doesn't really facilitate communication or negotiation. And all that's going to serve to do is harden sentiment on the part of Catalan's independence people, the Catalan separatists. So that's only going to get worse if the government does not bend at least a little in that regard. As for the Catalan separatists themselves, they don't have a huge majority in the Catalan government. And I was saying last week that I was surprised that they'd moved so boldly for independence when they didn't have broad support amongst most of the population. It's maybe around half the population that really supports them. And maybe not all of those are really hardcore supporters either. Some of those could change their sentiment very easily, depending on circumstances. Something else we talked a little bit about last week was that, a lot of the separatist sentiment stems not so much from a great passion for Catalan independence, so much as a displeasure with the current Spanish government run by, I think his name is Prime Minister Rajoy, probably mispronouncing it. Prime Minister Rajoy is heading a minority government in Spain right now, minority conservative government. And he's been on that party that's in power, that is running the government anyway, has been unpopular for a number of years now, but all of the elections that have been had over the past 5 years have ended inconclusively. And the way the Spanish Constitution is written, if that should happen, if a coalition cannot be negotiated that can negotiate enough seats to gain a clear majority, then power defaults to the previous political party that had been in power. I mean, I think I'm remembering that correctly. So, very unpopular incumbent sticking around, and that's kind of firing discontent in Catalonia, and that's helped the independence movement a bit, kind of goosed it more than it would have, given it more support than it would have had otherwise. So maybe if Rajoy were to leave, if there were to be another election, and an actual, well, maybe not popular government, but at least something more popular than the current government were to come into power, that might take some pressure out of the independence, take some of the wind out of the sails of the independence movement. Mm-hmm. That would help in and of itself. But going back to the Catalan separatists for their part, they've moved very aggressively for independence. I think I read that there was a vote in Catalan's parliament about whether they should try to hold a referendum, and they actually didn't have enough votes to win that. But then the Catalan executive branch, I don't know what they call him, I guess the Catalan prime minister, whatever he is, decided to just go through with it anyway, even though he didn't have permission or support from the legislature. So that kind of speaks to their perspective. It's kind of, in and of themselves, they are too hard-nosed and very sort of, they're not taking a very tactful diplomatic approach to it. So you have two hard-nosed parties negotiating, so to speak, with each other through very confrontational tactics, holding referendums that have been ruled illegal, not negotiating. The whole thing is just kind of a mess, and it's a perfect example of how not to deal with the separatist movement or how to run a separatist movement. Mm-hmm. That said, thus far the separatists have said that they want to run a peaceful movement, and they haven't really given much indication that they're willing to be violent. And given that the Spanish government has a monopoly on violence and could very legitimately, given the rulings by the Spanish Supreme Court, use that violence to maintain government rule in Catalan, rather. Mm-hmm. In lieu of a violent resistance, I don't think they're going to be able to get independence. In that sense, the Spanish government easily has the advantage, and so the status quo will probably prevail. Even if the Catalan government were to arbitrarily declare independence, I don't think anybody would recognize them. And even if they did, I don't think they would be able to separate from Spain. If the Spanish government was willing to flood in police just for a referendum, that really isn't a legitimate referendum anyway, because there were so many irregularities and so much disruption caused by the Spanish police. If they actually just declared independence and tried to separate. Certainly a lot more, I would imagine. So in lieu of a very organized, disciplined separatist movement, I don't think they have a shot. And I don't think they do themselves any favors by being so recalcitrant in that regard. So basically, as far as separatist movements go, the one in Spain and Catalan is kind of a horse and pony show. I don't think it's actually going anywhere. And I think it's more a product of internal politics in Spain than it is of some great sense of grievance on the part of Catalans.
Mm-hmm. Someone's saying so every state has a monopoly on violence. That's true, and we've talked about this before. That's the trade from the state of nature, which is effectively bandits. People who have the biggest sticks and clubs and numbers are going to be controlling an area, and the norms have changed over time, where we are generally more comfortable with the state having the monopoly on violence, as opposed to a bunch of competing groups of roaming bandits or feudal lords. Those were kind of the earlier steps where they did the governance and they decided a bunch of things because they had the sharpest weapons and the monopoly on violence. And now we have statehood, but that opens its own kind of realm of problems of how effectively are they governing, how corrupt is the state, are they serving the population, or is the population serving them? That kind of push and pull.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wasn't saying that the Spanish government... I recognize all governments have a monopoly on violence, but I'm emphasizing in particular that the Catalan parliament does not have that. Nominally, the Spanish government can subvert the Catalan police force, as they tried to do in the referendum, to mixed effect, admittedly. But nonetheless, they could easily subvert their police powers and leave them without any kind of force to use to defend themselves. And in that sense, with such an imbalance in power between the Catalan and Spanish governments, the Catalan government is at an extreme disadvantage. I mean, technically, the Spanish government could just disband the Catalan government, since the Catalan government only exists as a special provision in the Spanish constitution made for autonomy given to certain regions, i.e. the Basque territory and the Catalans, who have a history of separatism and a desire for more autonomy. So have you ever heard of hypersonic missiles?
No, but it sounds like they would travel very fast, if I had to guess.
They do at that. They do at that. From what I read some years ago, I think the fastest ones they were working on could go up to Mach 8, 8 times the speed of sound.
Wow.
Which is pretty damn fast. And what I was reading this past week was that it could pose a problem in terms of nuclear strategy. Because if you put a nuclear warhead in one of these things, that could create a kind of imbalance. Basically, you would have very little warning once you detected a hypersonic nuclear missile incoming. And as a result, nuclear-equipped nations may adapt policies that are designed to respond much more quickly to the first sign of a possible massive nuclear attack, because they might only have maybe minutes to respond before they get utterly obliterated in a huge barrage of hypersonic nuclear-tipped missiles. And so the idea is, the problem with that is that if nations do that, that creates a much smaller margin of error. So if you have a false positive, and you have a false positive as far as a nuclear attack, you think you're being attacked by a nuclear weapon with nuclear weapons. If you have 30 minutes or so to respond, you have more time to kind of clear that up and come to a reasoned decision to kind of undo whatever the false positive was. But if you only have minutes to respond, as would be the case with a barrage of hypersonic missiles, you may be much more inclined to just push the button to respond, so that you don't lose all your ability to respond, to counterattack. And the result could be an increased likelihood of an accidental nuclear exchange in that regard, because there is such a smaller margin of error. So there was some angst on the part of nuclear researchers on that count, and they were asking nuclear powers to reach some kind of accord now before hypersonic missiles are deployed in great numbers to try to mitigate that possibility.
The speed of the game has changed.
Can you talk about Puerto Rico and Tesla and how exactly they are helping with power and who funds that? I actually can't. That's actually in my reading list of articles to read from this past week, but I didn't have time to get to it, so unfortunately I can't. Yeah, I had seen that. There was some headline about Tesla offering to help Puerto Rico reestablish power, but having not read the article, I have no idea what it is they were posing to do. I don't know how much they really could do. An entire island of several million people losing electric power. Yeah, there is a pretty tall order, even for Tesla, I would imagine. But I don't know. I'm not a scientist. I don't know much about technology. Maybe they've got something fancy up their sleeve.
Well, the question is, who pays for it?
Yeah, I would wonder about that too. Presumably Puerto Rico. Unless they were just trying to exhibit some new technology and try to use the whole Puerto Rico situation as an opportunity to advertise, but I don't know that Tesla's ever done that before, have they?
I don't think so.
Nothing that I've heard of, anyway. Well, a little clarification. A couple weeks ago, we were talking about World War II, and specifically tanks, and I said that that Germany had actually weaker tanks at the beginning of the war than France and Britain, and somebody in the chat, I think, piped up and was surprised at that. And yeah, it's actually true. In 1939 and 1940 specifically, the Western Allies had the better tanks, better armor, larger caliber main gun, etc. Certainly later in the war, Germany had much better tanks. The Panzer IV the Tiger, the Panther, etc., all the legendary tanks of the war. Obviously, those were far superior to most anything the Western Allies had, certainly, if not most of what the Soviets had on offer. I guess the Panzer III is kind of in between. You could make a case one way or the other for that, but that was kind of 40-41, I think, is when that was deployed. But yeah, 1939 and 1940, specifically for the invasion of France, Germany was at a bit of a disadvantage. Yeah, Germany really hadn't been planning on fighting a war in 1939 or 40, at least beyond invading Poland. And it wasn't thought that the Polish military would pose a great challenge. They fully expected, or at least Hitler rather fully expected, that the Western Allies would fold again like they had in Munich and Czechoslovakia in that situation. So he was as surprised as anybody when the Western Allies finally got off their asses and decided to do something. Yeah, I remember reading about Munich, that the German officer corps was kind of, well, large parts of the German officer corps was very critical of the government's decision, Berlin's decision, Hitler's decision, to invade, or rather to lay claim to the Sudetenland. And they thought the whole thing was crazy. They thought surely the Western Allies would declare war, or at least threaten war, with Germany, and that Germany would have to back down. And this is a time in the mid-late 30s when there was still a large body of the German body politic that thought Hitler was crazy, and that there was no way he would stay in power for very long. He was too much of a loon. And it was thought by many that the Czechoslovak gamble would be the straw that broke the camel's back. Surely the Western Allies will stand up to Hitler now, and he'll be embarrassed and humiliated. But that didn't happen, and that shocked the hell out of the German officer corps. They couldn't believe it. And a lot of them, I remember reading an account of one officer who was very frustrated, actually, that the Western Allies hadn't done anything, because that would mean that Hitler would become much more popular. Kind of speaks to the complexity of the interrelationship between domestic political considerations and international relations. Oh yeah, somebody chimed in about Tiger, Panther notoriously unreliable despite being better on paper. Yeah, that's true. They were unreliable because they were much more complicated machines, and so they broke down very frequently, much to the chagrin of German tankers. Yeah, later in the war, mid-late, 43, 44, that especially became a problem. Less of a problem later on as the lines of defense narrowed. The Germans didn't have to defend, a broad front all over, 1,000+ miles of eastern front, kind of narrowed down over time. So they didn't have to be as mobile. But yeah, that's a fair point. On paper, they were much better, but there were a lot of issues with reliability that did not exist with, say, the T-34, which, while not nearly as complex, would at least run pretty reliable. You didn't have to worry about it breaking down that much. Similarly, so with the American M4 Sherman, which was generally very reliable, just not very survivable. I think American tankers called the Sherman tank a Zippo, if I'm remembering it correctly. Zippo being a brand of what do they call them? Lighter, like you would light a cigarette with. The reason they called them Zippos and compared them to lighters is because whenever they got hit, they almost invariably cooked off. That is to say, the ammo cooked off. The ammo would catch fire and start going off inside the tank. And if you're inside of a tank, the last thing you want is your ammunition to start cooking off while you're inside there with it. So they were very flammable tanks, basically, and American tankers didn't particularly like that. But while they weren't very survivable, they were very easy to mass produce, and they ran like clockwork. And so those two factors kind of made up for that lack of survivability. They generally swarmed German tanks to try to overwhelm them. Generally couldn't beat them one-on-one, certainly not from the front. German army was generally too tough on the front of their tanks for the relatively lightly armored Sherman to penetrate. There were better American armored vehicles that could, but those were generally tank destroyers, which is a different type of armored vehicle. And much bigger, especially with the main gun, much bigger main gun, but generally much thinner armor. Those were more for defense, or maybe offense against lightly armored targets. Yeah, I've heard the M1 Abrams described as a tank destroyer, sort of a latter-day modern tank destroyer. Pretty much designed to fight off swarms of Soviet armor in the prospective World War III, so that's not a stretch. What about the T-34? Read a lot of people consider that the best tank of World War II. Yeah. So the T-34 had an excellent suspension system that was actually designed by an American, if I'm remembering correctly. The United States Army apparently wasn't that interested, so he took his product over to the Soviets, and they were quite happy to buy it and incorporate it into their new tank. The revolutionary thing about the T-34, besides this excellent suspension system, was the sloped armor. That's the thing that always comes up. The armor was sloped in a way that made the armor more difficult to penetrate. And nobody had really done that up to that point. I think the T-34 was, if not the first, one of the first mass-produced tanks to feature that kind of armor. It also had a very low profile and a huge-ass gun. I mean, the German tanks in the early part of the war, kind of like what I was mentioning before, were generally like 25, 30 millimeter cannons. And even at the beginning of the war, the T-34 had a big 70 millimeter cannon, something in that range. It was huge for that era of the conflict. It also had broad tracks on it, and that was advantageous in the Soviet Union because the roads were notoriously bad. To Russians, they were notoriously bad. The Germans were not as aware of that fact. They learned that the hard way over the course of the war. But it helped the T-34 traverse all of that, muddy ground, or snow, as the case may be. And it was much better at traversing that Russian territory than equivalent German tanks earlier in the war. So on those counts, it was a far superior tank to certainly in the early part of the war, it was far superior to anything else anybody else had. And there are stories from the first, 6 months or so of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, in which German tanks and even anti-tank guns would encounter T-34s and their shells would just bounce off them because the Germans didn't have any weapons that had a high enough caliber to penetrate that thick sloped armor on the T-34. And the T-34s, of course, had these mega main guns that would just tear through anything the Germans had to counter them. It didn't end up saving the Soviets, though, because in the early part of the war, they just got steamrolled. A lot of that, part of it was just doctrine. They didn't have massed tank formations like the Germans did. They distributed their tanks more evenly across their army. And as a result, they weren't able to concentrate any large body of T-34s anywhere to take advantage of their innate superiority. So they generally got picked off one by one. They were isolated by infantry or German tanks. Get them on the side where the armor is thinner, or in the rear even. And then, of course, the Soviet tank crews were generally not very well trained. That was another big problem. Anyone who's familiar with the Eastern Front will tell you that one of the big reasons that the Soviets got plastered in the early part of the war in the Eastern Front is the purges of the Soviet officer corps that happened in the late 1930s. And a lot of big-named people who were very talented leaders were killed in that purge. As a result of which, there was very little expertise or experience amongst the Soviet officer corps, and including amongst lower-level officers, like what you would have in a tank. And those people were just steamrolled by the far more experienced German officer corps, who knew exactly what they were doing and were quite prepared for conflict. So, unfortunately, that advantage in armor, and represented by the T-34, the Soviets were not able to take advantage of that until probably more 1942 or 43, when they started to master maneuver warfare. It took them about that long to learn it, and they learned it the hard way against probably one of the best, if not the best, and most efficient military in military history. Pretty hard way to learn, but they did it, to their credit. Oh, another advantage, it was very cheap. Or that is to say, it was easy to produce. German tanks were made like fine watches, whereas German tanks were made like sledgehammers. They were made with stamped out materials, just crammed together in factories very quickly.
American tanks? You said German for both.
Soviet tanks. Soviet tanks were much more efficient. Yeah, American tanks were made in a similar fashion, made to be mass-produced, but Soviet tanks were far more simple. One of the examples of that simplicity was philosophy and technology. So, for example, German turrets on German tanks were generally hydraulic, electric-powered hydraulic, so that you could basically just push a switch, right? Push a lever, and the turret would turn for you. That wasn't the case with Soviet turrets, which were hand-cranked. You had to use manpower to turn those, and as you can imagine, that was a lot more labor-intensive. And German crews, as a result, were able to focus much more on targeting and positioning, etc., whereas Soviet crews had to worry not only about targeting and positioning, but also about operating all of this machinery that was all just done by hand. The same problem was in the air with the Soviet aircraft. German aircraft, everything was electric and hydraulic and very easy to do. Maneuvers that would take a few hand movements or, a few flips of a switch in a German aircraft would take, maybe a dozen or more levers or some such equivalent in a Soviet aircraft that was not so electrified and that did not have the benefit of electric motors and whatnot. So that alone was a big disadvantage. But the T-34 again made up for it by being tough as nails and mass-produced. They made tens of thousands of T-34s over the course of the war. Perhaps the Germans could have outproduced them if they bothered to try earlier, but they didn't. I think we talked in the first couple weeks when we were doing this that Germany did not really adopt a total war footing until, 1940, late 42, 1943 at the latest. And before that, the German government kind of had the attitude that, oh yeah, we'll definitely win, so we don't have to go all out to produce as much material as we can, or to put as many men in the field as we can. We can totally win this war with one hand tied behind our back. Didn't really work out that way, as history has shown, and they probably regretted that later. But it certainly worked in the favor of the Allies. Who knows what the Germans could have done if they'd gone all out from the start. At the end of the war, they were working minor industrial miracles. So it's probably for the best that they didn't. Even with all of the bombing and the lack of fuel, they still managed to produce immense amount of material even into 1944, which is just incredible. And that's to say nothing of the Wunderschaften, I think they were called, or something to that effect, the Wonder Weapons, which were these, incredible, technologically advanced weapons that the Germans had developed and were actually fielding at the end of the war. Bad management and delays and the lack of fuel and whatnot kind of mitigated that, but if they'd gone all out in the war much earlier, they might have had those weapons much earlier, and that could have made a big difference. I mean, it's a long list of stuff the Germans developed at the end of the war. I think they actually had night vision for their tanks in 1945. They had what was in effect the first cruise missile in the V1, what was the first ballistic missile in the V2. They actually had one of the first assault rifles. I don't know if they had it before the AK-47 came in, but I think it came in around the same time. So they had assault rifles. That was a big innovation. Again, though, only in 1945. They had the first operational jet fighter. That was the Messerschmitt 262 Condor. They never were able to get many up in the air, and fuel shortages mostly kept down the few they did have, but that would have made a big difference in terms of fighting off Allied bombers if they could have gotten up a lot of them. And they also, as I recall, had developed the first air-to-ground missile. And I don't think they ever deployed that in combat, but they did test it successfully. So just all manner of very advanced technology that would come to color future generations of warfare, they actually pioneered. No shock then that there was a mad rush for German scientists after the war by the Soviets and the Americans. Everybody went all out to try to collect as many as they could, because they had so many interesting goodies on hand. Now, for those who don't know, the head of NASA after World War II was, what was his name? Von Braun, who was actually a German. He'd actually been a scientist in Germany developing rocket technology for the Nazi German government. And the United States kind of picked him, nabbed him at the end of the war, and basically offered him, you can stay in Germany, which was not a great place to be in the late 40s, early 50s, or you can come over to the United States, the wealthiest country in the world, untouched by the war, and you can head our NASA program and play with rockets for the rest of your life. Well, he decided to play with rockets for the rest of his life. Yeah, very, very brilliant scientist over in Germany. Germany was actually the pioneer in science in the early 20th century. If I remember correctly, there were more German scientific articles, more scientific academic literature, and that was more referenced even in addition than the English scientific literature, academic literature. And so that was definitely, the heart of Western civilization as far as pushing technological development. That's not to say that, English and French scientists were not making leaps and bounds as well, but Germany was a big important part of that era and scientific advancement therein. Part of the reason the United States has done as well as it has was because we did get a good number of those scientists. Albert Einstein, in particular, is an example of that. We didn't get him at the end of World War II, but he was part of an exodus of German scientists that left in the 1930s because of the policies of the Nazi German government. And so the United States benefited greatly from him. It's a great deal of foreign scientists that have helped the United States achieve the technological advantage it has today, above and beyond indigenous American scientists, although we do have plenty of those. Not knocking American scientists, I'm just saying German scientists in particular have been prolific, especially in the early 20th century, and have played a big role in the development of 20th century technology. What's your favorite piece of post-World War II military technology and why? That's an interesting question, because nobody really talks about post-World War II military tech that much. Unless you're talking about modern tech. I guess I'm thinking more Cold War. Favorite piece? I don't know that I have a favorite. There's just all manner of weird shit you could point at. There was the Davy Crockett, which I always liked. And if you don't know what the Davy Crockett... Have we talked about that before, Neuro? I think we have.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, the Davy Crockett was, believe it or not, what would you call it? It was basically a hand-launched nuclear weapon. And the idea was that you would have this big rocket launcher that an individual soldier could carry, and he would just shoot off a low-yield tactical nuke out of this little rocket launcher. And this was early 50s when this was developed, and I don't know that it was ever widely distributed. But the late 40s and early 50s, military doctrine in that period was very much defined by the development of nuclear weapons. And the idea at that time was, maintaining a large standing army is expensive. The Soviets have a huge force. How do we make up for this disparity in numbers? Well, why don't we just put nuclear weapons in everything? That was the idea, and so part of the result of that, among many other examples of nuclear this, that, and the other, was that this Davy Crockett tactical nuclear weapon for infantrymen. They also developed a sort of nuclear backpack. Basically, it was a nuclear weapon you could strap to the back of what was then called the Underwater Demolition Force, I think, or something. Basically, the predecessor to the Navy SEALs. And the idea was, in the event of World War III, they could take these backpack nukes, swim up to Soviet ports or other infrastructure, have the set off the countdown on the device, swim away, presumably very quickly, and then destroy infrastructure using those weapons secretly, clandestinely. There was also Atomic Annie, which was this huge nuclear artillery piece. I don't think they made more than 2 or 3 of those, but a big artillery piece that would just lob shells that had nuclear warheads in them. Pretty intuitive. The idea is excellent tactical nuclear weapon that could wipe out whole formations of Soviet troops. They ended up not investing much in them, though, because they were such big targets. So if you're a Soviet aircraft and you see Atomic Annie, and you would see it from the air because it was so big, that would be an irresistible target, and it would not have been easy to defend. So it was thought that it was just too vulnerable to invest too many resources in. But they did build them, and I think 1 or 2 were actually deployed in West Germany for a while. Yeah, any number of nuclear weapons like that were developed in that period, and a number of aircraft that go on to be attack aircraft in the Vietnam War, had actually originally been developed to deploy nuclear weapons, to be carriers of nuclear weapons, and to be, in effect, nuclear bombers. Ended up being adapted for the conventional role for Vietnam, but originally they had not been intended necessarily for that. So that Davy Crockett was interesting. There was also this weird little plane called the Gremlin, and this never entered production. But the idea was that these big intercontinental bombers, the XB-36, I think, is the one they originally developed it for. But nominally, you could have adapted it for the B-52. The idea was that these big intercontinental bombers the United States was building were vulnerable. How do we defend them? Guns were less and less viable because of the development of jet interceptors and missiles and all this kind of thing. So what better defense would there be? It would be better to defend farther away from the bomber, but short of just loading up bombers with air-to-air missiles, how do you do that? So it was thought, well, what if you attached a small fighter to the bomber itself, just a very tiny one, and then it could detach and then dogfight with whatever fighters were intercepting the bomber, and then come back to the mothership. That actually was developed. Again, never deployed, but it was built. It was called the Gremlin, and it was just this tiny little thing, and I think it might have actually been based on a German design that was deployed at the end of World War II, Germans again. And, again, barely larger than the cockpit and maybe a small rocket to propel it, and of course room for guns. And they actually would have just attached it to the wing, the bottom wing of a B-52 or whatever bomber, and the pilot would just kind of hang out until he was needed, and the idea was he would then detach and go and fight, then come back.
Yeah, people in the chat are saying carrier has arrived. You know the carrier in StarCraft works that way, right? It's a big, huge, expensive, slow ship that has 8 little ships inside of it that it deploys the dogfight against stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, probably better designed than this thing was, I would imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the German equivalent was actually an interceptor. It was not designed to be a parasite, to be attached to a bomber.
Mm.
But the idea was that you would just have a little interceptor that was basically nothing but a rocket with guns on it, and you could build a whole bunch of them and then just launch them directly at forces of incoming bombers, and hypothetically it would tear through them at incredible speed because again it's rocket powered, and then come in for a landing, and then the pilot could get out and then hop in another one or some damn thing. But they built those for a while. So those were pretty neat, but that's not post-World War II. What else would be? I always thought the U-2 was really impressive. The U-2 spy plane was developed as, to be exactly that, just a long-range, high-altitude reconnaissance plane, specifically for spying. And this was developed in the early 1950s, I think, early mid-50s. And the idea was that radar was making it very difficult, increasingly difficult to just send planes, regular planes, over enemy territory to spy on them, over rival nations' territory to spy on them without getting caught. So it was thought, all right, these radars are getting more and more powerful. What if we just design a plane that flies over them, that flies so high that radar can't detect them? And that was the idea behind the U-2. And for a long time, that's what happened. The United States would just fly U-2s over the Soviet Union, over China, over Cuba, or over whoever, and would equip them with, of course, high-powered cameras with which to take reconnaissance photos. There we are, of various target areas of interest, and that worked pretty great until radar technology caught up with the U-2, such that the Soviets were able to start detecting them. It took another, period of time before they had missiles that could also intercept them, but eventually they did that, and that, of course, resulted in the famous shoot down of Gary Powers in 1954, something around there. Gary Powers was the pilot of a U-2 shot down over the Soviet Union, and that happened at a very sensitive time when Khrushchev and Eisenhower were about to have talks about some form of détente, basically, some early form of agreement, and that might have served to lower tensions between the Soviets and Americans early in the Cold War. But that incident kind of made that impossible. Khrushchev might have wanted to do it anyway, but he didn't feel that he had the political room to do it after the shoot-down. There were too many hawks in the Soviet Union who were crying out about American aggression and all this, that, and the other. So the space for that kind of early détente was lost. The opportunity was missed. And that was actually what spurred Khrushchev to famously slam his shoe at the UN. This happened at the UN after the incident, and Khrushchev gave this impassioned speech. He was a very impassioned guy. He was always screaming and yelling about something. And so he gave this impassioned speech at the UN, took off his shoe and slammed it on the table and screamed, "We will bury the Americans." Which, of course, was very disconcerting for Americans. I've talked with my grandparents who were around at the time, and they thought, oh, well, okay, everybody's going to die. That's it. That's World War III. It's over. Yeah, it was at a time of extreme tension. It really behooves world leaders not to act like children. Perhaps a very relevant lesson.
Not saying any names, but
yeah, there was. Yeah, I think it was. Yeah, it was Donald Trump. I think this past week that came out and said that diplomacy isn't working. There's only one thing that will work with North Korea, which of course he then left unsaid, which was probably wise. But talk like that is cheap talk. It doesn't really mean anything. Nobody thinks that the United States is going to initiate a war, and people are pretty confident that North Korea won't initiate a war since they'll inevitably lose. That would be the eradication of communists and the Communist Party in North Korea.
The joke answer that comes to mind when you say, if diplomacy fails, drop giant condoms on North Korea. Make them feel very insecure. Wasn't that a Vietnam War thing? I thought that was a tactic that the U.S. did briefly to just fuck with people.
I've never heard of that.
No, maybe it's
news to me.
Maybe it's just a Reddit meme or something. I don't know if someone wants to confirm that.
I don't know. That does have me curious. Yeah, there was all manner of weird shit that would happen in various wars, psychological operations and the like. But yeah, Trump was talking about, and the reason that's a little disconcerting that Trump would say that is that even though the United States has the advantage, and almost certainly neither party is going to initiate a conflict, there's always a certain unknown element that you have to account for. The unknown unknowns, as Donald Rumsfeld famously described them. The idea is that North Korea's government and the leaders therein are most likely rational actors, but it's always possible, however unlikely, that the game theory within North Korea's government and the political maneuvering within between the political actors in North Korea's government could result in a political equilibrium in which some party feels compelled to do something very aggressive and quote-unquote bold that could lead accidentally to a war.
Whoops.
Yeah, so that's possible. And so as a result of that possibility, most past presidencies have refrained from very aggressive talk. It's not that they think it's likely that North Korea would do anything, but they don't want to take the chance that they say something that leads to someone thinking they have to do something that could hypothetically lead to war. It's a precaution, basically, a game theoretic precaution, if you will. And Donald Trump does not seem to particularly care about such precautions. Again, probably won't lead to anything, but it is kind of getting more towards risky territory from a rhetorical perspective. Still trying to think of interesting post-World War II technology. Obviously, one of the coolest post-World War II pieces of technology, at least for me as an American, maybe this is my American bias, but one of the coolest was the SR-71 Blackbird. Have you heard of this?
Yep.
Yeah, you've heard of it.
I had a model of that when I was a kid, just because it was so awesome, yeah.
Yeah, if you don't know what the Blackbird is another reconnaissance plane, actually. It's actually a spy plane that was designed to replace the U-2. Once the Soviets designed missiles that could fly high enough to intercept the U-2, the United States government went back to the drawing board and said, all right, well, we still want to spy on people. We're not going to stop doing that. So how can we design a plane that can get around these air defenses? Well, we can't fly higher than their air defenses. What if we can fly faster than them? What if we can just fly faster than the missiles? And so they actually designed, Lockheed Martin specifically, or Lockheed as it was then, designed a plane, a spy plane, that flew at Mach 3 times the speed of sound. And the idea was that that would be fast enough to basically make the plane safe. Like, even if they detected the plane, they wouldn't be able to shoot it down, because nothing would be able to catch up with the damn thing. And, by the time they actually deployed it, satellite technology had evolved to a point where you could put high resolution cameras in satellites, and they could do the job just as well, and they didn't have to worry about getting shot down. So kind of stole the thunder of the Blackbird a little bit, but they still made them, and you did use them, I think, in places like Vietnam and other places with lots of air defenses. That they, well, I could still use satellites then. I'm not sure why they still use them, basically, but they did use them. They did throw them out. I guess they figured they'd spent the money on them, so they might as well use them. I think they only built, something like 2 or 3. And used them mostly in the 1960s and 70s, and after that kind of retired them largely in the 80s. I think they maintained one for NASA for the purposes of quote-unquote research. I don't know how accurate that. I'm sure they used it for research, but sometimes the military uses clever tactics in order to get what they want. And one of those might have been throwing a Blackbird to NASA just so that they could keep it around in case they wanted to use it again later. So the Blackbird, that was very cool. Very interesting piece of post-World War II technology. I don't know. I could go on and on. There's lots of weird new things. Well, not weird new things, but advanced technology that was really impressive for its day. That's become very normal now. Like Aegis radar technology. That Aegis radar was very awesome in the 70s. That was a major leap forward in terms of electronic warfare, in terms of ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. What do you think about Iranian and North Korean nuclear development, in particular regarding a recent picture that shows Iranian and Korean missiles having the same propelling systems? It wouldn't surprise me if they'd shared technology or gotten technology from similar sources, so that's no stretch. For those who don't know, North Korea, in part, was able to develop its nuclear weapons. Largely it was an indigenous effort, but they actually bought or at least presumably North Korean intelligence, bought a number of nuclear secrets from a Pakistani nuclear scientist named, I think his name was A.Q. Khan, if I'm remembering his name correctly. And he, of course, got into a great deal of trouble around 2006 or so, mid-aughts, I think, when that came out. Everybody was very upset with him for giving nuclear secrets to the North Koreans. But the Pakistani government and Pakistani public still kind of revered him as being this hero of the nation that was able to, help engineer these weapons and give Pakistan nuclear capability. So fallout was pretty limited. I don't know if he's still wanted by Interpol for that. Wouldn't be surprised. But regardless of whether or not he's still wanted, he travels everywhere with a pretty decent-sized bodyguard. A lot of people not particularly happy with him. I think the Pakistani government did kind of crack down on him a bit, though, and tried to implement measures to make sure he didn't sell any more secrets than anyone else. So I don't think that's a business he's still running. But that's an example of how technology can proliferate on the black market, and so I wouldn't be surprised if you saw it pop up in multiple places, like Iran and North Korea. If you don't want countries like Iran and North Korea, really the only thing you can do that will, for sure, if you want to be 100% sure that they don't develop nuclear weapons, is to just bomb the shit out of their research facilities. That's not a very popular option. A lot of people don't want to do that for obvious reasons. But there's not really any other measure that's as direct or will guarantee you, at least to guarantee to the same degree, a successful arrest of a nuclear program like that in North Korea. It's a little too late for North Korea. If you were to go after the nuclear program in North Korea right now with direct attacks like that, you would have to go to the mat with North Koreans probably in a general conflict. And I don't think anybody, certainly not the South Koreans, are particularly interested in that. Iran, though, there's still time. And so there's been a huge debate in the international relations sphere amongst academics and pundits and the like there, analysts, about whether the United States should just go and attack them, because obviously they have ways of getting around this, that, or the other agreement. That kind of comes down to how much you trust them to keep their word. There are people who advocate a direct attack, and then there are people who say, A direct attack wouldn't be worth it. They'd eventually just rebuild the program anyway. Let's try to solve the problem now rather than kicking it down the road like you would with a direct attack. Obviously, people who want a direct attack would quibble with the notion that it's kicking the can down the road. They would argue that that's pretty much the opposite of kicking the can down the road. But again, these are two different perspectives, and that's an ongoing debate. And which side of that you fall on is a function of your politics. People can decide that for themselves. But it's a tough call, because once Iran, or again some other country, gets nuclear weapons, they pretty much have them. You can't really take them from them. Even if you destroyed all the nuclear weapons, they would still have the capacity to build them. Or even absent the capacity, they would still have the designs. They could still rebuild all of that pretty easily. And that's another danger too. Even if you were to utterly destroy a country, remove a government that had illegally developed nuclear weapons, and stamp out all of that capacity and destroy all of the nuclear weapons they'd built, they could easily, as revenge, just release their design, and then anybody and their mother could build a nuclear weapon, which would be problematic for international security in a number of ways, as you can imagine. So even having nuclear weapons, even if you don't have many nuclear weapons, you can threaten other countries just with your own destruction, because you could release that information. That's part of the reason why the United States, among other powers around Pakistan, have not taken as direct an approach with addressing issues they have with certain tenets of Pakistan's foreign policy. We've talked about that a fair amount before. They're afraid that the Pakistani government would collapse, and then its nuclear weapons would fall into the wrong hands, and that nuclear technology and information could proliferate on the black market. That's a big problem in and of itself, probably far beyond any problem currently posed by the Pakistani government. So again, it's a tough call. It's a judgment call. Individual countries, mostly the United States. The United States is pretty much the only one that has the capacity to do a strike like that would disable a nuclear program like that. Yeah. And then again, it comes down to politics. The Bush administration, especially certain people within the Bush administration, were clearly very much for a direct resolution of the Iranian nuclear program and the problem it posed, if not also North Korea. But they did not get their way, not least because of massive political opposition in the United States, if not also within the Bush administration at that point. By the time Iran had kind of come up as a major issue and its nuclear program, Iraq was already turning into a giant mess. And so the Bush administration had lost some credibility as far as the efficacy of foreign interventions of that variety, even if it was a limited strike, as would have been the case with Iran. Yeah, it was kind of interesting watching the collapse in credibility of the Bush administration. I remember I was around for that, so I kind of got to watch that in person live. And, just there were so many misrepresentations and lies about the Iraq War. How many times, if you were alive during that time, how many times do you remember the government saying, oh yeah, we're about to turn a corner on the insurgency? They must have said it, so they said it so many times that people just lost any and all faith in the government. They just assumed it was lying to them about the course of the war in Iraq. And I remember the culmination, the point at which it became abundantly clear the administration had lost almost all credibility in that regard, was when they offered this smoking gun. The government had been saying for years that the Iranians were supporting Iraqi insurgents and helping them kill American troops there, which is no stretch, and it was almost certainly true. But they were having trouble convincing the public of it, and they thought, well, if we can produce some compelling evidence that it's true, then maybe we could use that as a raison d'etre, so to speak, a casus belli, to launch a strike against Iran's nuclear program. So they trotted out this equipment that they'd picked up off some Iraqi insurgents that had Farsi written on it, the Farsi being the language and script of the Iranian people, of the Iranian nation. And so the government trotted it out. They had a big press conference, and they were all very excited. And then it hit with a thud. It just had no impact. Nobody cared, because everybody just assumed they were lying. And it was at that point it became clear that they just would not be able to compel the public to further interventions of the sort that had been done in Iraq, or even of a lighter variant. There was just so much political opposition and criticism that it wasn't feasible anymore, even amongst a lot of people who supported them. There was just, even people who supported the Bush administration became very critical, increasingly so over time, about the trustworthiness of the administration and their decision-making capacity, and the degree to which they were dedicated to conservative ideals.
There was a documentary that was posted recently, not super recently, but it was about the difference between the information the CIA had on Iraq and Al-Qaeda and what was presented to the public as sort of a pretense for the Iraq War, and trying to make that connection between Al-Qaeda and Iraq, and how it was a bit of a stretch. Like, potentially, yes, there were some connections, but not really in the sense that it justified the full invasion. Like, if you want to invade Iraq, that would be to invade Iraq rather than to stomp out Al-Qaeda. It's shutting down Saddam Hussein for that. It didn't really make sense with what information the CIA had on the situation. So it was kind of the difference between CIA gathering information, handing it over to the executive branch for these big speeches and meetings, and then having a totally different speech being read from the information they gave, and they're kind of like, their head is just question marks of who wrote this. And I think it was Dick Cheney and the vice president kind of team that wrote a lot of those documents, trying to create a narrative where it made sense for us to step in.
Yeah, they had a conclusion that they'd reached, and they were looking for evidence to support it.
Yeah.
Very, very much a deductive approach. Yeah, they weren't looking for real evidence. They were just looking for political ammunition to support their pet project. I think the most the CIA found was that Saddam Hussein's government had not molested, basically, al-Qaeda operatives that had been at one point in Iraq. And I don't think they were even there for all that long. So absence of activity absence of action against an al-Qaeda operative, or whatever the circumstances were, was painted as outright systematic support of worldwide al-Qaeda operations. And like you say, that was a stretch. And that was among many, warps, many attempts to warp intelligence to fit a particular narrative to try to justify a conflict in Iraq. It really didn't surprise me that much, because I'd read as a kid in the 90s that the Iraq's nuclear program was in tatters and that it had basically been shut down. Mm-hmm. And so in my young, ignorant mind, that was sufficient evidence to make me think the government was bullshitting.
One thing that's been interesting to me, kind of thinking about the history of the world and the difference between Iran and a lot of other countries in the Middle East, is the Persian culture that's present there, and how you can't really just lump Iran with Iraq because they're neighbors, because they have a very different historical past, and the norms, as we talk about a whole bunch, that shape Iran are quite different from what shape Iraq. And it seems like even if Iran still has a very heavy religious overtone to its society, they have more of a respect for institutions.
Yeah, institutions are much stronger in Iran than almost any other country in the Middle East. Obviously, the exception is Israel, which has exceptional institutions, political, military, economic, etc. But Iran easily outpaces, probably every other Arabic country there. Maybe you could make a case for certain Gulf monarchies. They generally have pretty decent bureaucracies, but their political systems are not representative, and they're generally considered fairly sclerotic. They have a lot of issues responding to the needs of people and their concerns. Their legitimacy is predicated more on money, royalties distributed to the population, and general stability, which is in part offered by their government, but also offered in part by the United States and the security umbrella it provides. Iran, for its part, has kind of done it all itself, has been much more successful in building its democratic, if you can call that democratic, its political, let's call it that, political institutions. And has done so for some time. It started developing its modernizing, I should say, its institutions in that regard, of all sorts, economic, political, social, etc., at the turn of the century, I think, around 1900, late 1800s, something around there. Maybe early 20th century, again, I don't remember exactly. But at some point in that period, they started modernizing. And they did that in advance, well in advance of most other Arabic countries. Egypt is the only counterexample I could think of where they started developing around the same time. And Egypt hasn't been quite as successful, owing in part to foreign interference, but also in part because of disproportionate power held by the military and the judiciary compared to other institutions in Egypt. Iran doesn't have that problem so much. Their problem is more with the monopoly on political power held by the political right in the country, specifically the Islamists. Yeah, I'm trying to think. The Shah helped as well. The Shah's government over the course of the Cold War kind of pushed the country towards modernization and tried to strengthen institutions. But of course that ended early. But the Islamist political, parties, what have you, that seized power in 1979, specifically the Ayatollah, inherited those institutions, and so were able to benefit from their stability and quality of construction, so to speak. Yeah, Iranians ethnically are very distinct from Arabs. Arabs are Semitic people, whereas Persians are actually white people. They're Indo-European.
Mm-hmm.
They're very closely related to Europeans in that regard, genetically and also linguistically. Farsi is actually an Indo-European language. It's much more similar to European languages than it is to Arabic, which is a whole other family tree. Arabic has its own tree entirely, a whole different ball game.
I believe we talked, I think it was IRL, about the proximity of Farsi in its structure and sound to French. Now, it's pretty similar to French in a lot of ways.
Maybe we did. If we did, it was so long ago, I don't remember. But yeah, I hadn't heard that. That's interesting.
It's a cool
French.
language. Maybe
Indo-European.
someone else knows about that.
Yeah, by all means. That's one of the benefits of having chat here. People more knowledgeable who have know more about these subjects can kind of add detail.
Mm.
But Indo-European languages kind of sprawl across, obviously Europe, but they also extend across the Caucasus into Iran, and then into Central Asia a little bit, and then of course South Asia, where Hindi and other such languages are also Indo-European. I think in Central Asia only Tajik is actually Indo-European, and Pashtun, obviously, in Afghanistan. But then all the others there, the Uzbeks and the Kyrgyz and the, Kazakhs and the Turkmen, all of those are actually Turkish languages. Turkish is a very prominent language group in Central Asia. Geographically speaking, Turkish covers a much wider area in Asia than it does in Turkey proper. Yeah. For those who don't know, Turks don't come from Turkey. They actually originally came from Central Asia and migrated to Turkey, and eventually basically conquered and proliferated there and became the dominant ethnic group over time. In fact, I was talking to a guy from Turkey some years ago, and I was asking him if he could understand Uyghurs. The Uyghurs are this ethnicity in Western China that's actually Turkish, of Turkish ethnicity. And I asked him if, speaking Turkish, can you understand Uyghur language? Can you understand their Turkish dialect? And he said, kind of. It is familiar, but you can't quite it's, too different really to actually understand, but it certainly is familiar. They are interrelated, definitely. And there have been occasionally over the past century, there have been the occasional, Turkish nationalist who wants to create a greater Turkey that encompasses all of the Turkish-speaking nations of the world, all of the Turkish-speaking territories and peoples. I don't think any of them have ever gotten a lot of support, because that's a pretty tall order. But occasionally it's popped up.
One of the things we kind of miss out on as English speakers, I don't really speak another language fluently, but some Scandinavian viewers talk about if they grew up in Norway, for example, they can pretty much understand Swedish. Finnish has a tiny bit of overlap, and you might be able to get the main idea of what's going on, but it's pretty different. But Swedish and Norwegian are quite similar, where you can pretty much tell exactly what the person's talking about, even if you don't know every single word, just because how close the two languages are. With English, I feel like we don't quite have a sister language that's that close, where we can understand it.
Mhm. Not quite. I mean, in English, American English is just so dominant. It's hard to find other examples. Yeah, there's kind of what would you call it? A continuum, so to speak, of language. A given language has a sort of continuum, and on one side, in the middle there's the language proper, and then on the wings there are sort of divergences that are become increasingly unintelligible as the further away from the main language they get. So that kind of gets into the realm of accents, and then as it gets more different, it becomes a dialect, and then eventually it just gets so different it's in another language entirely. That's the case with Hindi, or Hindustani, I think it's actually called, in northern India. There's a continuum, a belt across northern India, and in the middle is Hindustani, which is basically the root of Hindi. Talk about Hindi a bit, because that's weird. And then the further east you go, the less mutually intelligible the local languages get with Hindustani. And the further west you go, the more it kind of evolves into Punjabi, which is kind of familiar. I once asked somebody from India who spoke, well, actually he was from Pakistan, but he spoke Urdu. And I asked him what the similarity was, if you could understand people who spoke Punjabi. And he said, yeah, it's hard, but it's possible. And sort of the analogy he drew was somebody from America, the United States, trying to listen to somebody with an extremely thick Jamaican accent. So if you talk to somebody with an extremely thick Jamaican accent, you can make out what they're saying, but it can be hard. And it might even be impossible. It's not that they're mispronouncing the words, it's that they're putting emphasis on different parts of the words such that they sound weird and you can't quite make them out. Something kind of like that is what it's like.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I guess you could call thick Jamaican a kind of dialect of English, although I don't think it's sufficiently different to qualify as a dialect. You might have to go to some Creole languages in, some place like Guyana or the Caribbean to kind of find a real dialect of English that's sufficiently different in that regard.
What about some of the stuff in Britain? You've got some Cornish and some Cockney that are, I would say, completely unintelligible to a lot of English speakers.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I'm sure they would argue that they're not speaking it wrong. That's how proper English sounds, and that we Americans are the ones getting it wrong. But of course, that's a matter of subjective. We've got the bigger country and the more people, so we're probably going to win that battle.
Yeah, that's been a point that I reiterate a whole bunch, is that everyone has an accent. They think of themselves as, I speak the normal version of my language, and then there are people with accents who speak different than I do.
Yeah.
Lingocentrism, is that a word? It's a word now.
Yeah, I think the old saying in the linguistics community, and I'm probably going to butcher it, is that a dialect is a language with an army, which reflects the fact that languages that are larger and dominate in larger states are more likely to be recognized as languages and not, I think I got it backward. Languages are dialects with an army.
Right.
So you're more likely to be recognized as an independent language if you're the predominant language in a large country. Whereas if you're a smaller country, your language is more likely to just be a dialect.
Mm-hmm.
Hindi, and this is kind of off topic a little bit, this is some trivia. Hindi is actually an artificial language. It's kind of made up, so to speak. It's actually predicated on Urdu, which had been a language of the Mughal court. The Mughal Empire ruled over broad swaths of South Asia. But the Mughal royal family, such as they were, and their officials and whatnot, were descended from Central Asians who spoke Turkish and Persian languages. So they didn't really speak the native dialect, the native languages in India. So how do they try to communicate with each other with all these different languages? Well, they actually just created one. They created a sort of hodgepodge of Persian, Turkish, and what was called Karabali, I think, Hindi. And Karabali Hindustani was a dialect of Hindustani that existed around the Delhi, the capital of the Mughal Empire. So they just took bits of Karabali Hindustani and mixed it with Persian, usually technical words in Persian and Turkish, and created what is now called Urdu. and that became kind of the national language, the lingua franca, at least in northern India. And that lasted for a long time until the British came and then made English the lingua franca and kind of supplanted Urdu, although Urdu was still widely used, especially amongst the Muslim population. Well, then India, of course, had its independence movement. There were a lot of Indian nationalists, especially Hindu nationalists, and they wanted their own language. And when India and Pakistan were partitioned, a lot of Hindu nationalists, if not Indian nationalists generally, wanted their own language that had no attachment with Urdu. But Urdu was already so widespread and so widely spoken, they couldn't really just create something entirely new. So what they did is they took Urdu, which again, the root of which is Karaibali Hindustani, which is the language around Delhi, the dialect around Delhi. They took that and they just stripped out all of the Persian and Turkish loan words. And they replaced all of them with Sanskrit words. Now, if you don't know what Sanskrit is, that's like the Indian equivalent of ancient Latin. That was sort of a core language that existed broadly across India that eventually evolved into the different languages that exist today in India, especially northern India. So they took all these ancient Sanskrit words and tried to, rejig them, engineer them, change them, whatever, to describe ideas and technical things and whatnot that had been described with Persian and Turkish words. And those were all stuck in to Urdu, and that's what Hindi is. Hindi is actually just modified Urdu in that regard, modified with Sanskrit terms that were just created on the fly in the mid-20th century. It's quite a fascinating exercise in nationalism and social politics, social engineering, if you will. Yeah, Hindi as the official language of India has been controversial for some time on that count. Because people in southern India don't speak languages that are even in the same family tree as Hindi or Hindustani languages. They're in a separate family tree that's Dravidic in origin, or that's called Dravidic, rather. And they don't particularly want to learn Hindi. They already know their native languages and English. And that's quite enough for them. They don't want to have to go and learn Hindi as well. So there's been a great deal of resistance on that count, and as a result, English is still one of the official languages of India, even though there was a big push to replace it with Hindi after independence. So, some trivia for you. Again, a little bit off topic. What do we got? We got some, what do you think of Trump's claim, calm before the storm comment? Yeah, basically we talked about that a little bit earlier. It's mostly meaningless. It's just more cheap talk on the part of the Trump and North Korean governments. But again, like I said earlier, it's kind of getting into more and more risky territory as he escalates further. Again, the risk is still pretty low, but there's always that off chance that there's some state of play in North Korea's politics that would lead someone to try to do something crazy in response to a claim like that. What consequences do you see for the global economy as the information/data share of economic activity rises, given that information/data can be duplicated at zero cost? That's a broad question. Well, I guess the easy answer is that the economy will become more and more digitized, and that people will increasingly work remotely as that becomes just more and more cost effective. There's a series that the BBC World News has been running for the past, year or two. And it's basically, it's called 50 Inventions That Made the Modern World, something to that effect. And one of the things they talked about was computers. Obviously, computers are on the list. And computers, when they first really became mass-produced in the 1980s, there was a big lag between the 1980s. And actually, I think I might be thinking of the internet. I think it was the internet. So from the time the internet became big in the 1990s, there was a big expectation that it would revolutionize the workforce and the way it worked. But it didn't really happen very quickly. And in fact, it's kind of still playing out. It's taken several decades to make what changes there have been in place. And there's still a great deal of scope that could, for it to occur in. And the example the author gave, whoever it is that's producing the series, the BBC, was to talk about electric factories, electric factory equipment. And originally in the late 19th century, all of the factory equipment was steam powered, and it was very intricate but very well developed. The technology had matured to a point where it was kind of at peak efficiency, or at least at something close to it. And a lot of factory owners actually were resistant to adopting electric factory equipment because they just weren't familiar with it. They didn't really know how it would change anything. The costs was not that different between the two types of equipment at that early stage in the history of electric technology. And so they kind of lagged. And even after the cost effectiveness of electronic motors improved, even then they still were resistant because not only do they have to consider cost effectiveness, they also have to consider the fact that they're not familiar with the technology and the cost that could be incurred therein. If you're not familiar with it, you're more likely to screw it up somehow, and then you have all these extra costs to try to adapt the technology, fix the technology, learn the technology, etc. So a lot of people were resistant to it on that count. And then a lot of people also, there were all these little efficiencies that come with maintaining technology you already have. Not beyond just expertise, you have all these spare parts and all of these investments you've made over time in the present technology. If you change technology, then all of that investment is lost. So part of it is just lag in that regard. You make a 20-year investment in steam technology right when electric motors come out. You're not going to turn around as soon as electric motors come out and just dump all that steam tech. You're going to try to ride out the investment because you're probably not going to get your money back if you sell it, right? So you might as well just use it. So it actually took something like 20, 30 years for factories really to start widely adopting electric factory equipment and to reap the benefits of doing so. So it actually takes a considerable amount of time for major changes in technology, such as the internet or what have you, or digitization or electric motors, to kind of wind their way through the economy. Not just in terms of adaptation by producers, but in terms of affecting, workforce culture, in terms of law, in terms of all these other factors that go into production. When you have new technology, you don't just start using it right away. You have to figure out what the best way to use it is. And that can be a bit of a learning curve, and that can incur some cost. And, moving up that learning curve just takes time. And because only really risk-tolerant people will try to move up that curve at first, it's a pretty small number generally who try to move up the curve in the early stages of a technology. So once they've moved up that curve and kind of proven that a given method of technology can work in a given way, then late adapters come in and start adapting late adopters rather come in and start adopting the technology, and then it becomes more widespread. And then of course the wider ramifications for workforce culture, how you work, when you work, the legal circumstances, etc. All of that kind of adapts at that point, but only at that point, much later after the technology has been introduced. So we're kind of still in the middle stages of the internet's adoption rather, by the wider economy. We're still moving through there, and the full ramifications are not yet really completely known. There's new things like blockchain technology and, remote working. I mean, flex time is partly a product of that. There's a whole lot there to get into, and I'm not so well versed in all of it that I can dig into it in detail. But it's not so clear that you could really make an accurate prediction of a fully accurate prediction, rather, of how the economy is going to change as a result of digitization. If you do have such an accurate prediction, or think you do, then I recommend you invest now, because now's the time. You could win big and on the stock market with that knowledge. You could also be very generous and share it with us in chat.
Subtle plug.
Let's see. How do you think transhumanism and posthumanism could affect international politics in the foreseeable future? For the foreseeable future, probably not much, because I don't think it's at a stage yet where it's being or going to be anytime soon widely implemented. I'm sure chat will be able to provide any number of counterexamples to that statement. But as far as I know, I don't know of any widespread adoption of that kind of technology that really presents deep ethical questions that might challenge or otherwise become significant at an international level in terms of international politics. I welcome anyone to give me an example to kind of give me something to work with in that regard. But as far as I know, I don't know of any. Transhumanism was more of a Kukio thing. He read a lot about that. He was more Kukio was my transhumanism guy. He would talk all about it, and what I know about it, I principally learned from him.
There's quite a bit of it that relates to brain science. I think the main opposing factor that kind of adds the political element to how transhuman a given country wants to be is when you start to cross traditional lines of what used to be in the divine territory that now we're kind of manipulating. So being able to create artificial meat and stuff, it's kind of a new step forward. Adding chips to your brain, like, where is the soul, where is someone's spirit? Science tells us that it seems like what constitutes a person's self and personality and awareness is in the central nervous system. So if you're modifying that, are you corrupting the soul or damaging something like that in some way? So I feel like the technology isn't quite there where the leading countries are grappling with that in their kind of progressive conservative mixture, but it's something that we'll probably see in the next few decades. First in the most developed countries, and then it'll kind of go down the chain from there. But it'll be pretty interesting.
Yeah, there could be ethical questions raised on, maybe religious or other moral grounds from more conservative countries. And so whatever advantage such advancements give to those developed countries will probably be developed countries that mostly pursue it. Whatever advantages they get from those will probably be greatly opposed on the part of those conservative opponents. That could lead to some tension, but I don't know if it would lead to war or other such things. Maybe to a breakdown in trade, since there might be significant economic advantages to adopting transhumanist advancements over and above, give you a big advantage over those countries that fail to do so or prevent people from doing so. That could be an economic problem and a big monkey wrench in international trade negotiations. International trade negotiations are not very sexy, though. Most people, when they talk about international tensions, are talking about conflict, because that's the hot, sexy thing in history that people like to talk about. There could be problems in terms of intelligence. If there were some transhumanist development that improved intelligence, that could be a huge problem, not just between countries, but within countries. There could be a lot of ethical questions about that. If one country doesn't want to do it, but finds itself falling behind because its people have not enhanced themselves, so to speak, they could be either impoverished by not implementing it, or break their values and be sort of forced into implementing it in order to survive. Something like that could set up a larger conflict of some sort.
I would argue that technically that already has happened with smartphone access, where intelligence is less of the ability for an organism to critically think, and it's more the volume of the knowledge that's available to it. And people who have smartphones, countries that have like widespread smartphone use, you have pretty much the entire internet at your fingertips at the push of a button on a mobile device, where you don't need to be hooked up on a land connection for your internet or your desktop. You can be just out wherever and you can look up something and gain a whole bunch of knowledge. So that is, I would say, one form of transhuman unfair advantage. Kukio and I actually called that our exobrain. So stores of information are an extension of your mental knowledge store, where you can call on that whenever you need to if you have to look something up, which adds to your effective intelligence score as a creature that needs to make decisions. An example would be something breaks down in your vehicle, or you have some real life problem, you go and you Google a guide for a solution to that problem. That's effectively intelligent information that you're getting from your device. That is an advantage that people in a lot of developing countries don't have. Either they don't have a phone, or they don't have a phone with internet access and that kind of capability. The evolution of memory, as Fuzzy Cord put it, yes.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought of that. It's an interesting perspective. Yeah, having the sum total knowledge of 10,000 years of human civilization at your fingertips is something of an advantage. I would imagine. I remember I read an article some years ago from an older guy some old silver-haired fox who was of the mind that that this would be a revolution for people living in rural areas, because he'd grown up in a rural area and it was very hard to get access to the same degree of information that people in the cities had. But with the internet, that's kind of gone. You can totally have access to that kind of information that people in cities have. And so that sort of traditional disadvantage faced by people in rural areas has been erased, or at least erased in large part. Maybe will be erased completely at some point in the future. And that in and of itself is a significant change. That has huge ramifications for culture in rural areas. It used to be that rural areas were sort of redoubts of traditional culture. And, whatever country you live in, that's almost always true. But now that bubble has kind of been popped, penetrated by the internet. And it's kind of an open question as to what effect that has. Maybe the internet will revolutionize and kind of overturn traditional cultures, but it could have the opposite effect as well. It could serve to kind of reinforce them. That's also quite possible. People are quite keen to find things on the internet that tell them they're right, and that their traditional culture is quite correct, and that all these other people doing things differently are wrong. That's a confirmation bias. So that could serve to act as a preservative of traditional culture in the face of what might otherwise be a irresistible force for change.
Yeah, you kind of have examples on either side. It's a very large equation to evaluate which direction the internet is pushing us. So a personal example from my life was a lot of information that was available to me online kind of arguing for or against Christianity, where in my day-to-day life, all of my friends and family and everybody was Christian. So there wasn't anything as a resource that was arguing against my position. It was everyone supporting each other and kind of agreeing and trying to strengthen each other's beliefs, as opposed to directly challenging and asking, is this legit? And YouTube has a ton of debates on the topic, so I watched a lot of those, which was information that I would not have had without internet access. And then stuff like Reddit having a really big atheism subreddit, where that's a community where people who are often in areas where it's not safe to out yourself as a non-believer, they can talk to each other and kind of confide and share stories, and also just learn about what it means to have a non-religious perspective on the world. So it's interesting. But then you also have stuff like the alt-right propping up in the US and having a bunch of different websites and forums where they all communicate and network and stuff. So you've got a little bit of both. It's hard to say which direction it's moving in more overall. I would guess that it's going to kind of act as another form of progress, but it's going to be slow and uncomfortable. And it does increase the voice of the extremes, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder sometimes if the internet is not so much a force for change as it is an amplifier for broader forces of change that occur in other areas of society, be they economic or political. An open question. More data is needed. We'll see.
Yep.
Let's see. How do you know People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn? Do you find it accurate? I haven't read it. It's the book shaped a lot of my attitudes towards U.S. history, especially labor, union, safety. I'm curious on your opinion. I haven't read it. I've seen it referenced a lot, and I've heard a fair amount about it, but never actually read it. I've probably read more textbooks than I have books like that over the past 10 years. That's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's just, that's why I haven't read it. I've been in grad school forever, I had been in grad school rather, longer than I care to remember. So I didn't get a chance to read a lot of books like that. And since then, I've had lots of individual problems that have kind of kept me away, so kept me preoccupied. Having not read it, I don't really want to comment on it too much. I can't comment on it too much. Any opinion I'd had would be kind of superficial in that regard, so I won't say anything about it. The impression I have of it, from what I've heard about it, is that it's kind of more of a left book, it exhibits a position that is representative of the political left, put it like that. And having not read it, I can't say how biased it is in that regard, but, being a commercially released book, it wouldn't surprise me. Generally, the more successful commercially released books are those that take a particular bias and try to explain how it's right and how those bastard opponents are wrong.
Bastards.
Yeah, I'll try. I need to read more books like that just so that I can have an informed opinion about them, so I don't have to give impressions and other vague such things. What is that? Howard Zinn's History of the United States. All right, I'll put that on my reading list. My huge reading list that I will never finish, even if I try to finish it for the rest of my life. Oh, that's nothing. You should have. I had to break one tab in Chrome last week because I just had so many tabs. It just was breaking my computer. Do you know how many tabs I had in Chrome in one tab?
I've seen it. You're a hoarder.
I had 25,000 tabs in there.
What the hell?
25,000 links to articles and who knows what, all kinds of crap. And I had to try to save what I could. I tried to copy paste them into Excel because I didn't know. I'm not technically proficient. I'm sure there's a much more efficient way. But that's how I did it. I saved the 25,000 links that I will absolutely never finish reading. I think if I read 10 a day, it would take something like 3 years to read through all of them.
Mm.
So there's not a chance in hell of that happening. But I'm a hoarder, like you say, so I can't quite bring myself to part with them. So they're safely stowed away somewhere where I can pretend that someday I'll pay attention to them.
Yeah. I think Pact can kind of resonate with you on that front. She likes to collect a lot of tabs and keep stuff that seems interesting. I'm kind of the opposite, where every day when I log onto the computer, I want to have a fresh browser with nothing on it, and then kind of build it up from there. And I'll have some stuff in my bookmarks, but not like physically in the browser tab. And I think part of that is related to the load of streaming, where that's another big kind of resource hog. And if there's a game going as well, I just wouldn't have the RAM to mass a bunch of tabs.
Let's see. I'm an American of Greek descent. The joke has always been that we don't like Turks. We can talk about the long-standing cultural conflict of Greeks and Turks after what some of my community members call 100 years of Turkish occupancy. I think it was more than 100 years. I guess it depends on, well, yeah, Greece proper would probably be. I'm pretty sure, though, yeah, more than 100 years. Yeah, the Greek-Turk rivalry goes back a long way. You might remember, I actually said earlier, the Turks came from Central Asia. Before the Turks came into the Anatolian Peninsula, it was populated by various Indo-European groups, I think descended from the Hittites or something like that. And the Greeks, for their part, were making inroads along the coast. So the western coast, the northern coast, and part of the southern coast of the Anatolian Peninsula was kind of largely dominated by Greeks, or at least in part dominated by Greek populations. And then the Turks came in and started pushing them back and started conquering those areas and incorporating them into what at first I think it was the Seljuk Empire. I'm probably butchering that pronunciation. Seljuk Empire, and then later the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottomans, for their part, generally, well, for the era, were relatively lenient. If you can call requiring people to give up their firstborn sons lenient, but make of that what you will. That was the famous Janissaries, or Janissary system, whatever you want to call it. And yeah, they conquered those areas, and by and large, they kind of let the Christians there be Christians, but they gave very good incentives to convert to Islam. And so the Greek populations there were not quite oppressed, per se, depending on your perspective, but certainly they had a hard time. And there were periods when they definitely were oppressed. There were periods when the Turkish government cracked down very hard on the Greek populations, especially in Greece proper. Yeah, I don't quite remember when they conquered Greece, actually. It must have been in the Middle Ages. I think that's when it would have been. Maybe 1400s or so, something around there. That's why I say that I think Greece was occupied a lot longer than just 100 years. I think they were conquered in Greece proper, mind you, not just the Greek territories in Western Anatolia. Conquered in the 1400s and held until the early 1800s. So let me see. Over that time period, the Turks, the degree of oppression the Turks inflicted upon the Orthodox Greek population kind of waxed and waned depending on politics in the Ottoman Empire. And then eventually, the British, being nerds, being all taught about classical Greece, got really excited about an independent Greece, about bringing it back, so to speak. And they, with the Russians, kind of teamed together to support a Greek uprising in the early 1800s. And Greece finally got its independence back. Didn't quite look like what it looks like today, but they did get their independence back. And so that led to about 100 years of internecine warfare between Balkan nations seeking their independence or seeking to grab territory from the faltering Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman Empire itself. And that, of course, culminated in World War One, which was the prelude to World War One was the Balkan Wars, which I think was two separate Balkan wars between basically alliances of different Balkan nations and the Ottoman Empire. And they were just carving up the Ottoman Empire's European territories. And then World War One happened, of course, and that was sort of the last straw that kind of broke the back of the Ottoman Empire in Europe for good. And Greece's independence was assured. It was already pretty assured by Russia and Britain, pretty powerful countries to be protected by, but after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, that age-old foe had disappeared. But there was still a lot of tension between Turks and Greeks, though. And this actually is probably more what this person is talking about, the 20th century tensions in particular. Because while Greece was independent, had its own territory, there were actually still a lot of Greeks living in the Ottoman Empire on the Anatolian Peninsula, because there was that ancient settlement of the coastal regions of the Anatolian Peninsula by Greeks. In fact, I remember reading somewhere that the cultural center of Greece, of Greek people rather, of Greek culture was actually in Izmir, in a city in western Anatolia. You know, it was not actually in Greece proper. It was actually outside of Greece in the Ottoman Empire, because the Greeks there were so wealthy and there was so much Greek business there and whatnot. Well, after World War One, it was decided that the Ottoman Empire would basically be broken up, partitioned, if you will. Turkey itself was actually set to be partitioned. That didn't work out because of a Turkish nationalist rebellion kicking out all the foreigners that were trying to occupy different parts of Turkey. But anyway, the point is, part of that settlement involved relocating all the Greeks, well, specifically after the war in which the nationalists won. After the nationalists won, there was an agreement in which all the Greeks living in Anatolia would be expelled to Greece, and all the Turks living in Greece would be expelled to live in Turkey. And the only exceptions to that agreement, were, I think, around Istanbul, which had a particularly large Greek population, by no means a majority of the population, or even a particularly large minority. But there was a large number of Greeks there, and so the Turks agreed to allow them to stay, if in exchange Greece agreed to allow Turks living in Thrace to stay. Thrace is sort of the northeastern part of Greece, that little arm that extends into the northeast. So that deal was made, so those people were allowed to stay where they were, but otherwise huge numbers of Greeks and Turks were forcibly relocated from their homes into different countries, into the respective countries. And that led to a huge amount of enmity, and basically what amounted to ethnic cleansing. There was a particularly famous incident, I think in Izmir, actually, in which the city burned. Supposedly, Turks burned the city and slaughtered some number of Greek people who were still there, who hadn't left the city yet and had been evacuated to Greece. So, as much bad blood as there had been from the occupation of Greece proper over the course of Ottoman history, I think that particular episode of forced relocations after World War I and the Turkish War of Independence, which I think is what they call it, that particular violent episode colored Greco-Turkish rivalry for the past 100 years, basically ever since. Because there was just so much violence and bad blood created, and lots of ethnic tension created there on that account. So much so that one of the reasons that Turkey, or rather maybe it was Greece, wanted to join NATO was just because the other country got in. Greece and Turkey joined NATO at about the same time in the early 50s. And both countries were kind of skeptical about it. But once both of them started negotiation, were approached by NATO, they were both receptive once they knew the other country was interested. Especially Greece being the smaller country of the two. Almost more afraid of the Turks than they were of the communists there. And the communists were a big threat at that time, so that's saying something.
I have
Greek
the map
Civil
pulled
War
up here, so we have the visual of where northeastern Greece and northwestern Turkey kind of intersect. So Istanbul has the land bridge that kind of reaches into Europe, and then Turkey has
Yeah.
some territory on the either side, and then it meets Greece and Bulgaria.
Yeah, exactly. That's sort of the common area. Those two areas together were the areas where forced relocations were agreed to, where the people there were spared forced relocations. That was the common agreement.
Mm.
But everywhere else, not so much. Everybody else got screwed. And that was a much larger body of the population. You know, millions of Turks and Greeks were forcibly relocated that way. Yeah, Izmir is kind of down there to the south a bit, sort of in the middle of the west coast of the Anatolian Peninsula. Substantial city even today, not nearly as much so as Istanbul, but very important still. Yeah, part of the agreement made between Turkey and Greece after the war was that Greece would get all of the islands, even the ones very close to the Anatolian Peninsula. So anything that's an island there belongs to Greece in the Aegean Sea. But anything that has even, you know, the smallest isthmus attached to the Anatolian Peninsula is Turkish, which has led to some weird borders there.
Mm-hmm.
Greece and Turkey are nose to nose in some areas on that count.
Are the islands very populated?
No, I don't think any of them really are. Some more so than others. You know, obviously Crete or Rhodes or some such thing has relatively more population, but in general, no, they're not densely populated at all. As far as I know. Anyone who knows better, please correct me. I want to learn. I would want to know if I were wrong. So please do correct me whenever I say anything wrong, stupid, or questionable. Let's see. So that's what I know about Greece and Turkey. Maybe that's not as much detail as this person could provide, but that's what I know. That's what I've read anyway. Let's see. I would like to know your thoughts on the YPG and the conflict between them and ISIS. Yeah, so for those who don't know, the YPG is a Kurdish militia in Syria. Basically, the Kurdish population there, which is pretty concentrated, they generally predominate in the areas where they live. They formed a militia, and I don't remember what YPG stands for. I think it's something like Popular Militia or some such thing. And they kind of came up when the government collapsed, basically in eastern Syria. Kurds in Syria largely live in eastern Syria. And the Syrian government basically lost almost all authority there over the course of the civil war. So the Kurds formed militias to try to protect themselves. They were not that interested in independence. I thought this was interesting. They didn't immediately take the opportunity to fight the government and declare independence. They mostly just wanted to stay quiet, partly because they probably knew if they declared independence, Turkey would have jumped on them, among other powers in the region. We've talked before about how unlikely a Kurdish state is due to the animosity of neighboring states. So there was no great push for independence. They instead tried to basically reinforce their autonomy and just kind of police their own territory to maintain stability, to make sure certain groups, like say ISIS, did not move in and take control and, well, kill a whole shit ton of people. Some trivia for you: there's not a few Kurds in ISIS. It's not as though ISIS is an exclusively Arab organization. They have Muslims from all over the world, including Kurds. And Kurds, for their part, are by no means a uniformly nationalistic entity. It's not as though every Kurd is innately a nationalist who wants Kurdish independence and fights with and for Kurdish independence movements. There are a few who are Islamists who will fight for radical groups of one sort or another, nationalists in the sort of traditional sense of the word, Syrian nationalist Kurds, Iraqi nationalist Kurds, etc. So there is some diversity there. I think the majority of Kurds would want independence, but there are enough Kurds who fight for other movements to not make it a monolithic group. So the YPG is sort of the Kurdish manifestation of Kurdish autonomy and militancy in eastern Syria. And they fought ISIS. They have not fought the Syrian government. They kind of have an understanding with them that the YPG is sort of a placeholder. Not explicitly against the government, but not explicitly for it either. They're just kind of keeping the peace until some arrangement can be made as far as the future relationship between the Kurdish regions and the Syrian government. But they definitely did fight ISIS and probably a few other rebel groups that tried to horn in on their territory. They also have something of a relationship, although it's not entirely clear the depth of it, with the PKK, which is a Turkish separatist group, Kurdish separatist group that has long operated and fought the Turkish government, pretty much for the past 30, 40 years or so, something in that range. The PKK is considered an outright terrorist organization. I think in the United States recognizes them as such. The YPG is not recognized as a terrorist organization, but their links with the PKK kind of make them questionable. The United States is a little iffy on them. Not so much that it won't work with them. The United States has worked with them quite a bit. In fact, they're the principal component in the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is the sort of combined Kurdish-Arab umbrella organization the United States and probably monarchies in the Middle East as well, in the Gulf region, have created to try to fight ISIS and, well, probably eventually fight the government, although we don't really quite allow them to do that just yet. Unlike, say, the rebel groups controlled by Turkey, which doesn't have as much of a problem with that over in Idlib province. So the YPG, big sort of an ally, de facto ally of the United States. They work with our special forces people, and they work with the local Arabs who are willing to join with them anyway. Arabs are always a little suspicious of Kurds in whatever country. But the Arabs in Syria are willing to work with them. Better option than ISIS anyway, and for many people a better option than the Syrian government. For now, they're just focusing on fighting ISIS as per the arrangement with the United States. But they're also kind of on and off having to fight with Turkey and Turkish rebel groups, because Turkey has shifted focus from the Syrian government to Kurds and Kurdish independence, because that's become a significant issue since, well, let's say since the war between the PKK and the Turkish state has taken off again over the past 5 years. That's kind of a politically correct way of saying that. A less generous soul might say that Erdogan cynically restarted the war himself in order to gain election advantage for a referendum that he wanted to have. But of course, such a person would be very cynical indeed, and I don't know if you could really prove that in court, which is why I'm reticent to say it. But there is that suspicion circulating amongst those suspicious people in the world. So Turkey and the Turkish government, certainly the Turkish military, which is always very skeptical of anything Kurdish, certainly related to Kurdish independence movements, has been increasingly hostile to the YPG, which has required more and more American intervention and pressure to try to ward off conflict between them. It's not really clear the extent to which the YPG would go to the mat for the PKK, how deep that relationship is. The Turks insist it's a very deep relationship. I haven't seen much proof of that, but then who am I? I'm a fat guy sitting in front of the computer. I don't have access to that kind of intelligence. But from what I've read, I haven't seen a lot of evidence of that. Could go either way, but haven't seen much evidence to that. So, the YPG, its future is very unclear. It's not clear if the Turks will steamroll them once the war with ISIS is over, whether the United States will still stand by them, whether they'll reach an arrangement with the Syrian government. They're kind of a third wheel in the Syrian civil war. The Syrian civil war is really much more about the Gulf monarchies fighting with Turkey, fighting with, the Iranian-Syrian axis, and, whatever the hell Russia is doing there. I don't think even they know at this point. The YPG and ISIS are kind of other secondary forces there at this point. Even if there's a lot of focus on ISIS right now, not like a major factor in the Syrian civil war, broadly speaking. And they're probably not going to be a factor in whatever negotiated settlement ends the conflict, assuming such a thing ever happens. I also know the YPG is relatively socialist. I remember reading some years ago about an American who went over to volunteer to fight with them. And he actually left them because he didn't realize that they were quote-unquote Reds, as we call them here in the United States. Reds is sort of an old-fashioned term for communists and lefties. So he didn't realize they were quite as socialist as they were, and he ended up leaving and ended up, I think, joining a Peshmerga at some point, which have much less of a leftist ideological bent. Peshmerga, for those who don't know, is the Kurdish militia in Iraq, and it's sort of the militant arm of the two major political Kurdish parties. Two major Kurdish political parties in the Kurdish regional government in northern Iraq. And they don't have really any ideological slant, so to speak. They're really just more conservative, nationalist Kurdish organizations, unlike the PKK or the YPG, which have roots going back to the Cold War and have some socialist connotations to their ideology. That's about what I know about the YPG and ISIS. I guess I could mention the Battle of Kobani. That was a big deal for a while. Kobani was a city on the border of Turkey that was Kurdish, or at least partly populated by Kurds, and ISIS pushed on it, and the Kurds fought a huge pitched battle with them. And I remember there were a number of conservatives in the United States who were very excited about it, thought the Obama administration was, betraying our Kurdish allies by not doing more to save them in Kobani. But then, of course, the criticism, the counter-argument was Kobani doesn't matter strategically in any way, shape, or form, so what does it matter? The only way it mattered is that it bled ISIS. And that wasn't a huge strategic priority at that point in the conflict, as far as the United States was concerned. At that point, the Obama administration was trying to minimize American involvement and to kind of deputize American allies in the region and give them responsibility for managing it. They largely started the conflict in the first place anyway. So there was a sense of justice in that. You broke it, you buy it. We didn't screw this up this time, so this is all on you guys. That was sort of the attitude in Washington, at least in certain quarters of the Obama administration. So the YPG fought tooth and nail for a long time against ISIS there, and I think like after a month or two, they eventually managed to win. ISIS was kind of fended off. The city was utterly devastated in the process, and some people have described it as a sort of battle of Stalingrad, although that doesn't mean much at this point. I've seen almost every major battle in eastern Syria described as Stalingrad, and northern Iraq for that matter. Almost anything involving ISIS in a large urban area has been called like Stalingrad. So it's kind of been debased of meaning at this point, as far as that analogy goes. So that's what I know off the top of my head. Maybe not as much. You mentioned specifically the conflict between them and ISIS. I can't get into that as much. I don't know like the tactical details, and I can't give you like a solid rundown of all the interactions between them and battles and whatnot. But that's a rough summary for you. Surveys on beliefs like I am primarily in my own level of success still have way, way higher adherence in the US than in other countries. So even though the sheer size of the Indian and Chinese economies could make the US irrelevant, I'm still bullish on its long-term prospects. Do you believe, as Drucker said, that, quote, culture eats strategy for breakfast, end quote? Do you think the future US will be able to retain economic hegemony through cultural factors like this? Okay, multifaceted question there. Short answer, probably. There's that, culture on the one hand does give a lot of advantages in so much as it gives advantages in the economic sphere or political stability. If you have a strong political culture like the United States has, you can suffer a lot of things that would heavily destabilize other countries and manage them much better because you have so much reverence and adherence to that traditional political culture. We talked a little bit last week about how in the United States business culture is much more forgiving of failure, and it's almost considered a badge of honor to be able to, to try to have a business and fail and learn from it. It's almost considered advantageous to have that experience because you've been there, you know what you're doing, unlike somebody who's completely new, who maybe has more advantages, better background, etc. Maybe that guy has better resources, but he's not as experienced, so he's more likely to make the same mistakes that you made. You, on the other hand, have more experience, know what you're doing, and are a safer bet in that regard. That's kind of the attitude in U.S. business culture, and that's not an attitude shared in very many other cultures. It's actually pretty rare, and it's a big advantage. So that's an example of culture giving the United States an economic advantage. And so in that regard, and that ties into what he references here about in terms of, are you in control of your own level of success? Americans disproportionately believe that. You can quibble about whether that's because the United States is because, a really powerful country, has lots of resources, blah, blah, etc. Whether that facilitates that mindset, or if that mindset facilitates prosperity. That's a chicken and egg argument. You could go on and on about that. But regardless, this kind of ties into it. The United States, I think, could be argued uncontroversially, in large part, to benefit economically from its culture, in so much as its culture has largely evolved over the course of American history to be a commercial culture. I mean, the United States has basically started as, and has evolved over time as the world's largest, the largest maritime republic in history. And if you know the history of maritime republics like Venice, like Genoa, etc., to a lesser degree Constantinople, those were immensely wealthy mercantile republics. I guess Constantinople was never a republic, but it was a mercantile nation. It was a trading post. And the United States is basically that, only on a continental scale. And our culture has evolved from the start to kind of adapt and reflect that. So in that sense, the United States has a very commercial culture that encourages entrepreneurship and is forgiving of failure and is beneficial in that regard. In that sense, yes, the United States will continue to have a big advantage over countries like India and China that while bigger, don't quite have those same cultural edges. That said, that doesn't mean that it's inevitable that the United States will benefit from them. For example, culture can change. As much an advantage as culture can give, cultures are not fixed. In fact, they're very, very malleable. They can change quite a bit over a very short period of time, which makes it impossible to make long-term predictions about culture. And hell, it makes it very difficult to even study culture in the present, because it's sort of an amorphous idea. It changes from person to person. You can't really pin it down and study it, like you could with a butterfly or a rock or, in something like some hard science equivalent. You can't do that with culture. It's just very difficult. Having a background in social science, I can attest to that. It's obscenely difficult to pin down abstract social abstractions and institutions like that. So it could easily change, and that advantage could be lost or gained by rival nations. So that could easily determine whether the United States continues to prosper, continues to be the world's preeminent economic hegemon. Also, even if China and India do not adapt to those kind of cultural traits, they could still easily surpass the United States. I mean, you don't need a large percentage of a body of people of 1 billion strong to be very successful in order to be a very powerful economy. I mean, you could subtract the population of the United States from the population of either China or India, and those countries would still have more than 1 billion people. I mean, that's just how massive they are, just how huge the number of people is there. So if even a small fraction of those people becomes very entrepreneurial and does very well, that could put the United States in a bit of a spot. If you pinned me down and you made me make a prediction, I would say the United States will still probably be economic hegemon, but that its market share, so to speak, of global economic activity will probably erode. Now, losing market share like that, having your share of economic activity fall, doesn't mean you're producing less. In fact, it can mean you're doing better. You can actually produce a lot more and become much more prosperous, but still have a smaller share of the overall pie, so to speak, of economic activity. This kind of ties into arguments about inequality. Even if there's more inequality, people can still be better off if they're producing more, if the overall pie is growing, so to speak. So the United States could well continue to prosper, and I think it will. I think it'll continue to be sort of the mecca, so to speak, for entrepreneurs all over the world, just because it has that business culture. And I think it'll probably keep that culture. Again, culture is malleable. Who knows what'll happen with it? Maybe it'll get better. Maybe we'll lose it entirely. It's impossible to tell over the long term. But for now, I'll predict that we keep it, and that the United States remains a preeminent location, the preeminent location for people who don't want to deal with all manner of political bullshit and cultural bullshit that inhibits economic activity in most countries around the world, including to a degree in Europe. The United States is a great country if you're a workaholic. If you're willing to work your ass off and bite the bullet every now and again, odds are you'll be relatively successful, and the rewards are much greater here than for equivalent such people in other countries. So I think we'll derive a great advantage in that regard.
We've talked about the concept of temporarily embarrassed millionaires in the U.S. and how the American dream a lot of times involves, if you're good enough and you work hard enough, then everyone should be able to be really successful. So if you're not, it's just a matter of time, really. Like, if you're going to have your major breakthrough, you work hard and you're great and smart in general. So someone's rich now, but soon you'll be rich as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very common attitude here. Very prominent. And you don't see it as much in other places. You do see it in other countries. Anglo-Saxon countries in particular, Canada, Britain, New Zealand, Australia, they all have relatively dynamic economies compared to peer countries in the developed world. And that's part of the reason they all kind of share that trait. Mm-hmm. But it's also shared in certain other countries. And it's actually even common in certain subsets of a population, amongst certain castes in India that have histories as merchants, merchant castes, trading castes, etc., or even Brahmins who are frequently involved in trade. a lot of those peoples actually have that same attitude and become very successful. There's a reason that something like 90% of motels in the United States are owned by Patels, Indian migrants. They come in here and they're just very good at commerce because they have a long family history of it, and they succeed, wildly in a political, socio-economic environment that just values that skill set that they've cultivated over the course of centuries or millennia. They're just sort of a natural fit. They fit like a glove, so to speak. Kind of less so Chinese. That's actually an advantage India has over China. Indians are much more common. Obviously white people are the most common in terms of corporate executives, in terms of corporate leadership. But if you compare Indians and Chinese corporate executives, Indians are actually much more common. It's actually quite rare, apparently, outside of China anyway. Obviously China's the exception, but outside China and other Chinese territories, it's relatively rare to see Chinese executives. They tend to kind of get stuck in middle management or professional jobs, whereas Indians tend to much more frequently rise to the top. They're much better at getting and keeping leadership positions. And I think that is partly because of that commercial tradition amongst certain groups there. But the United States, it's not just a subset of the population, it's kind of the population writ large. And it's almost sort of in the DNA of the culture broadly. It doesn't really matter if you come from a country that doesn't have that in its cultural DNA. Once you spend a generation or two in the United States, it kind of gets in your blood. You kind of adopt the same attitude. Part of that is just because living in America, it can be a little bit cutthroat. It's we don't have as much of a social safety net as certain other countries in the developed world. And of course, that's a source of great consternation for people of certain political persuasions here. But one of the results of that, for better or worse, is that people are heavily motivated to move their ass. If you don't work, if you don't do anything, odds are nobody's going to come to your rescue. And of course, that's not quite accurate even in Europe, which is the principal counterexample. There have been a lot of welfare reforms there, and obviously you have to try. Relatively few people are just not working out right. But in the United States, the welfare programs here don't hold a candle to those in Europe. So there's a lot more impetus to do something, to work in some degree. And again, mixed bag, make of that what you will, judge it as you like. But that is a push factor that encourages some degree of economic activity that would not otherwise occur. So I hope that addresses that question to some degree. That's kind of a meandering answer.
That's what we're good at.
The internet, or more specifically the social media of Internet 2.0, seems to have become an attack vector used by state actors to wage psychological warfare against the population. I suspect this person has a military background. Used by state actors to wage psychological warfare against the populations, and therefore the governments of rival states. Do you see any strategies, technological, political, or social, for blunting this kind of attack or inoculating the population against it? There was an article written in Foreign Policy magazine written recently that, of course, I didn't read. Again, very busy this week. But yeah, for those interested in this topic, I would encourage them to seek that article out. I imagine it addresses this pretty directly. But here's the thing. I would disagree with the notion, and again, this is subjective, so everybody has their opinion on this. But I would disagree with the notion that it constitutes a form of warfare. And obviously, you could color it that way. It is a kind of competition. Obviously, they're trying to sway populations and politics. But there's a guy named the War Nerd, Gary Brecher. I'm almost certain a number of people listening have heard of him. Probably this person. He's made the point that this is not a type of warfare. There's not really such a thing as cyber warfare. This is, what this person is talking about, a kind of extension of cyber warfare using social media or Internet 2.0 to quote unquote attack populations, to attack rival states. This is not so much, again, to make this point, it's not so much cyber warfare, it's more just espionage. And espionage is ancient. That's been going on for as long as there have been political organizations of any sort. You can see that going on in Greece, ancient Greece. Polities, empires, what have you, would use any manner of nefarious, underhanded tactics to try to undermine their opposition. When Persia invaded ancient Greece, they would try to bribe people. I think that might have That might have been from 300. I don't quite remember. Maybe not historically accurate, but I'm sure somebody tried it at some point. Just bribe the enemy. I know the British tried that when they were colonizing India. If you want to call that colonizing in the 1700s, we've had that discussion before. The East India Company and in India in the 1700s, whatever you want to call that. One of the reasons they were able to succeed is because they won a couple major battles by bribing generals in the Mughal army. So bribery obviously is very direct. This is much more indirect, but again, I don't think it's new. I mean, the Soviet Union and communists went out of their way to try to subvert, quote unquote, politics in the United States and the West by, well, just engaging in political discourse. I mean, if you can undermine a society by creating clickbaity headlines and all manner of outlandish news stories, that doesn't say as much about the nefarious genius of the cybersecurity strategy. It says a lot more about the weakness of the country you're targeting. You're not really causing problems, you're more just exacerbating problems that are already there. And if you're really worried about this, the proper counter to this kind of strategy, in my opinion, again, all very subjective, make of it what you will, in my opinion, the best counter is to address the underlying political issues that make these vulnerabilities susceptible to exacerbation by foreign rivals to begin with. Race relations in the United States are not bad because of Russia. That's not something the Russians did. That's something that we are quite capable of doing on our own here in the United States. The Russians might be able to exacerbate it. They might be able to exacerbate Islamophobia, for example. I think there was a recent story I read about a Russian-created page complaining about a minaret or a mosque in Houston. And it was like some Twitter or something, and they decided, okay, we're going to all get together and we're going to have a rally to try to protest this mosque, and etc. And the whole thing was nothing but Russians. So of course, none of the people involved in setting up showed up because they're all in St. Petersburg or whatever. But then a whole bunch of other people did show up who were of that mind, Americans who kind of had that mindset. They actually had read that and showed up for the rally. And, again, that's not undermining the United States. That's not destroying American culture or attacking a rival. That's just exacerbating an existing political wound, so to speak. And you can argue, well, yeah, but still, that's a form of attack. Well, yeah, but I don't think it's an attack. I think that's just espionage. That's the exact same kind of agitprop that political groups inside the United States already do. So Russia's not doing anything new in that regard. And I'm sure there's more than a few Americans in the United States who probably do similar such things in Russia of one sort or another. Certainly the CIA would love to. They probably don't particularly care to, because I doubt it's very all that effective. The fact that the American intelligence apparatus is not that excited about it, I think, is part of the evidence that it's not a very effective strategy. It's one of those sort of low-risk, low-reward strategies. You can do a lot of it, and it'll probably very rarely have any significant impact. But maybe every so often, something will happen that's kind of big because you were engaging in that kind of activity. But I doubt it would ever be really significant. For example, I very much doubt that Donald Trump won the 2016 election because of anything Russia did. I'm very confident of that, and I can't prove it, but I'm pretty confident of it. I would hazard that as a pretty safe bet, so to speak. I don't think future historians will say, oh wow, those Russians, they really pulled it off. What genius. No, it's probably just, oh yeah, Trump was elected and then Russia kind of tried to do something and then failed miserably, probably. I don't think it's just an efficacious strategy. Chat is probably exploding. I'm sure there's any number of people disagreeing with this. But again, this is my perspective of this issue. It just seems like normal espionage, normal political discourse that has happened for as long as there's been discourse. It doesn't seem out of the pain of, out of the realm of what had already been going on.
Well,
so
I think
don't consider it that threatening.
The broad way to think about it is less in terms of did the Russian intervention cause a Trump presidency so much as is the new frontier of internet espionage an influential factor in the outcomes of how cultures develop and who gets elected. It is a factor, but you're saying that it's not the critical main factor. Like, he had a base.
Yeah.
There was a clear population in the U.S. that would have voted him regardless of what Russia posted on the internet.
Yeah.
That type of deal.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. You know, there are underlying issues, there are underlying forces, political, social, economic, that are far more important. And you might be able to exacerbate them a little bit with a cyber strategy of this sort, but I don't think it'll ever be that significant. It could be more significant in a country with a closed political system, like China, or to a lesser degree, Russia, because people in those cultures have political cultures that are very mistrusting. You know, if you grow up in an authoritarian country, you don't trust government because it lies all the time. This kind of goes back to what I was saying about the Bush administration. They lied so often about the war that just nobody trusted anything they said about it. So imagine the same sort of thing extrapolated to all aspect of government. Just the government is all powerful, all encompassing, and lies incessantly. Why would you ever trust anything they had to say unless it was just blatantly obvious that it was true? A lot of people don't. There are some patriots who do, just out of deference to their country, because, you know, all right, yeah, the government is shit, but it's my country. I have to do my patriotic duty. I have to at least pretend that they're telling the truth. Outside of that core group of nationalists, there's a lot of people who just don't trust. And in a society like that, people are much more susceptible to rumor. And so in that sense, a cyber attack strategy that focuses on undermining public political discourse and the political culture, taking advantage of that vulnerability, as well as any other social tensions that might be in the country already. A cyber strategy would be, you know, a cyber social attack strategy, whatever the hell you want to call it, would be much more effective in a situation like that specifically. But for a Western democracy, and it's, you know, the Western democracies that kind of feel besieged by this kind of thing right now, which is why we're discussing it now and why the broader population is discussing it. In Western society, there's more, well, we have political pluralism. We have open societies for the most part, some more than others, but in general, we have open political systems. And so there's much more scope for people to talk, interact, exchange ideas, criticize government, hold a government accountable, etc. And as a result, there's generally more trust in government. And so it's a lot harder to kind of undermine faith in the country and the government when you can kind of check in periodically to see if rumors are true. If somebody spreads a rumor that says, hey, there's an extermination camp for black people in Alabama, well, if it were China, it would be pretty hard to verify that, because if it were true, the government would probably be very effective in covering it up. But here in the United States, you can totally just go to Alabama and be like, yeah, there's no camps here. Probably not true. Probably put that in the false list on Snopes or whatever people use. So the open political system facilitates more trust, and that trust acts as an excellent defense mechanism against these kinds of attacks. So I guess you could say that's another counter you could have, you know, besides, I already forgot, whatever it was I said before, whatever the other counter I said. Another counter could just be good governance. If you have good governance, people are less susceptible to lies like that, lies about what the government is, social tensions and etc., what have you. Good governance cures a lot of ills. I highly recommend it to anybody who can get it. Let's see. Is the Iran-Iraq-Turkey military alliance a real thing now? No, it is not. So rest easy. It is not a thing. Iran and Iraq, kind of. Iran has a lot of influence in Iraq. So even if you're a hardcore Iraqi nationalist that hates Iranians, doesn't want them in your country, and just wants to stymie them wherever they are and whatever they try to do in Iraq or elsewhere, you have to have some deference to Iran, because they're this huge-ass country right on your border, and that has its claws deep into the Iraqi politics. And, you know, they have deep connections with a number of powerful political parties. So you can't be too hostile to them. But that said, it's also wrong to say Iraq is an Iranian puppet. There are Iraqi nationalists there, and they are not all together pleased with the large role Iran plays in the country. They do want autonomy. They do want independence. You know, they don't mind if Iran wants to help Iraq, if they want to invest, if they want to help economic development, you know, if they want to help stabilize the politics, which they probably don't want to do, but in so much as they do, that's all very welcome. Things that Iran does, like supporting Shia militias, that's a lot more controversial. Probably not if you're in one of those militias, but if you're in a rival militia, or certainly if you're a Sunni, that's a big problem. So there is that Iranian role in Iraq is controversial even within Iraqi politics, and their relationship with, the relationship between Iraq and Iran is not that of an outright alliance. I think it would be more accurate to say that Iran has allied with certain political groups in Iraq, certainly certain Shia militias anyway, and certain political parties, but not an outright alliance with the Iraqi state. Which probably suits the Iranians fine, because they have a similar situation in Lebanon. They're not really allies at all with the Lebanese government. In fact, the Lebanese government probably hates them. But there's a huge militia. Lebanon has a large population of Shia Muslims, and they prop up, pay for, and man a huge militia in Lebanon that's actually more powerful than the Lebanese army. And that militia actually has more or less an outright alliance with Iran. So Iran does not have an alliance with the Lebanese government, but it has an alliance with a political entity in Lebanon that is actually more powerful and more important than the Lebanese government. And that suits them down to the bone, because then they can avoid all of the little problems that come with dealing with the government. See Syria. Syria had an alliance with Iran, and they paid for it very dearly. Lebanon, in contrast, doesn't have that problem. Nobody quite wants to undermine Lebanon, because that government is not pro-Iranian and because there are a lot of anti-Iranian political forces there. But it doesn't really matter because, again, Hezbollah is the principal driving force. The government could rule against Hezbollah all at once, but it doesn't have the monopoly on violence that would be needed to enforce such a ruling. And for that matter, Hezbollah has a strong political hold in Lebanese government. So even if they wanted to, they wouldn't be able to, because Lebanese parliamentarians would probably block it. Somebody more familiar with Lebanese politics is probably having a laugh at this. They could probably elaborate and give all the details I'm missing, but that's my understanding of it. Turkey and Iran are not allies at all. Turkey doesn't have friends. I think we have at least one regular Turkish listener, and they could probably tell you that I think it's an old saying in Turkish. I don't quite remember how it goes, but basically it's to the effect of, there is no friend of a Turk, or Turks have no friends. And basically it's the sentiment that Turkey is just surrounded by rival countries that don't like it and are constantly competing with it.
Well, that's part of the issue with being a bridge nation, where you're
Yeah.
you're not quite Middle Eastern, you're not quite European, and neither side really identifies with you. You're the outsider to both of them, so they're kind of self-reliant in that capacity.
Yeah, it doesn't help that they're an isolated ethnicity. There are no other Turkish, there are really not really any other Turkish nations around them. I mean, to the north it's Europeans, to the south it's Arabs, to the east it's mostly Indo-Europeans. The nearest Turkish country, I think, is over in Central Asia, which is, across from the Caucasus. There might be some in the Caucasus, a few small groups in Russia, but for the most part, yeah, they're pretty isolated, ethnically speaking. They're just sort of this weird group that is completely unique and isolated in that regard. So Turkey also is very powerful in the region. It's probably the most powerful military in the Middle East. I don't think that, the United States, fine, but it's of the countries actually in the Middle East, they have the most powerful military. And I think they also have one of, if not the largest economy. And I might add here that most of the large economies in the Middle East are principally oil-driven, driven by oil exports. Turkey isn't that. It has as large an economy as almost any other economy in the Middle East, but it doesn't depend on oil, which gives you an idea of how diverse and dynamic it is. It's a much more healthy economy than most of the economies in the Middle East. So it's a very strong regional power. And so in that sense, they don't really need Iran's friendship or alliance, so to speak. And there aren't really any problems that they share or any problems in Turkey that they need Iran's help with. So there's no real impetus for Turkey to reach out to Iran. So in so much as they've talked to Iran and interacted with them, they've only really done so to kind of coordinate on Syria and probably the Kurds most of all. That's the principal problem they share. Both Iran and Turkey have large minorities of Kurds, and neither government is particularly eager to see Kurdish separatists bite off a chunk of their territory. Beyond that, there's not a whole lot of ties. They mostly kind of leave each other alone. They just don't interact much. and they just don't have much to push them to do so. So I wouldn't worry about it, put it like that. That's not a big deal. Maybe you could say Turkey and Iraq have good relations, but a lot of that is just because Turkey wants good relations in Iraq so that it can exert a lot of influence there. Turkey doesn't exert nearly as much influence in Iraq as Iran does, but they do have good relations with both Baghdad and the Kurdish government, the Kurdish regional government in northern Iraq. And generally it tries to maintain relations with both so that it can continue to have economic access and political influence amongst the various political actors there. Yeah, there was a time when when the region was rather more peaceful. Well, in so much as that's a thing. It would be more accurate to say maybe 10 years ago or so. Turkey had this big push under Erdogan to try to exert its influence in the region, kind of reassert itself as a regional power, not just a regional power kind of acting at the behest of the United States. They kind of want to have their own independent diplomatic and foreign policy, diplomatic position. So they started reaching out to the Kurdish regional government in northern Iraq, improving ties, and so economic ties were significantly improved. You know, the Kurds exported a great deal of oil through Turkey as a result of those kinds of deals. And so there was a great flowering, so to speak, of relations there. And then Baghdad, Turkey also improved relations with Baghdad in order to facilitate the improved relations with the Kurdish regional government, because the Iraqi government nominally had sovereignty over Kurdish territory and technically could have used various means, legal or otherwise, to kind of scupper or otherwise undermine the Kurdish region there, thereby kind of reducing an ally of Turkey. So the Turks didn't want that, so they tried to engage with everybody and make everybody happy. That strategy kind of floundered over time as the Kurds, the oil price collapsed, so the Kurds didn't make as much money. ISIS started killing everybody, which undermined stability in the region. So the whole program has become something of a hash. They may return to it at some point, but for now, I think they're mostly just protecting what limited gains they've made. So overall, this triple alliance is not really a thing, I don't think. There are ties there, certainly. There are diplomatic, economic, political ties, but nothing that you could call a military alliance. Sorry for coughing, I know that bugs some of you. I've been talking a lot today, not even before I got on stream. I've been talking with a client, proofreading, for about 6 hours. So I'm a little hoarse. Could you just pass something? Oh, no, regarding the... Oh, okay. Oh, you're welcome. About a month ago, Turkey bought some missile defense systems from Russia. I think we even talked about that. Do you think this is indicative of some political agenda within Turkey that favors Russian relations over their Western relations? No, I don't. I don't think it's so much Turkey shifting away from the West towards Russia. I think it's Turkey shifting away from the West towards Turkey. Again, Turkey's kind of shift has been towards more of an independent diplomatic strategy, more of an independent streak in international relations. So I don't think they're getting close with Russia. I think they're just trying to make some kind of deal with Russia. We'll probably hear about it in the next couple months. Once it becomes apparent, it'll probably manifest in some way, probably dramatically. But no, it's probably just deal making between. I don't have proof of this, so I can't say for completely sure. But my guess is that it's probably just deal making on the part of the Turkish government vis-a-vis the situation in Syria. Russia and Turkey are pretty much the dominant actors in the Syrian civil war at this point. So they've probably just been negotiating and horse trading regarding what each party, Russia and Turkey, will do in Syria going forward. Since again, the equilibrium in the Syrian civil war is about to break. Everybody's been kind of keeping it down low, keeping it quiet, while everybody focuses on ISIS. That's been the principal impetus thus far in terms of that conflict. So as ISIS falls, and eventually probably will be outright defeated, though it'll never disappear completely, as they're defeated, there's going to be less and less reason to not fight each other. All the different factions in the conflict, the Turkish-backed factions, the Gulf-backed factions, the Russian, the Iranians, the Syrians, they've all had more or less something of a ceasefire in place. Once ISIS is gone, which was the reason for those ceasefires, it's not really clear what'll happen going forward. So I suspect this deal has more to do with that than it does with any greater diplomatic shift on the part of Turkey. I might add that Turkey and the Turkish government has a very different vision for the region than Russia. Russia is very much a status quo power in the region. And that's pretty much the extent of their strategy there. Just try to maintain the status quo and hope that makes them an attractive ally. The Turkish perspective is more revolutionary. They have more of a populist Islamist vision for the region. You know, fewer absolute monarchies and authoritarian nationalist governments and more people power, so to speak, in so much as people power is Islamist anyway. That's obviously more attractive to the social conservatives in Turkey, who generally hew more towards a political Islam, as they call it in political science. So let's see here. Yeah, so that's, in short, that's kind of a truncated version of what I said last week about it. Oh, somebody had the quote. The quote is something like, "The Turk has no other friend than the Turk. That's it. Thank you." Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, they have something of a complex in Turkey. They have something of a checkered history regarding their neighbors, so they're a little bit paranoid. Understandably so. I don't blame them.
So when you said that you were a little bit hoarse, the coughing and stuff, some people took that as you are a small ungulate creature, a hooved animal. You are a horse. But Packed Facts took a moment to reassure the chat and let everyone know that you seem stable to her.
Yeah, I have not transformed into a horse, nor am I in the process of doing so. So rest easy.
As far as we know.
No, it's just a bit of a dry throat at this point. Going to get a lot drier even after we finish this. I'm probably going to spend the next 4 hours trying to finish this paper. So let's see. In recent years in the U.S., the Republican Party has come to dominate rural areas of the country while the Democratic Party dominates in urban areas. This has resulted in the Republicans gaining a lot of power at the local and state levels. What can the Democratic Party do to be more successful outside of urban areas? That's easy. Design a political platform that is attractive to people who live in rural areas. That sounds stupid simple, but that's exactly what you would have to do. Right now, the political platform that the Democratic Party upholds is specifically custom designed to appeal to union workers, whom are not a major political force in the country anymore. So that alone tells you something about the inefficacy of Democratic strategy. Labor union workers, students, young people, whom are notorious for their low voter turnout. So that's another bad bet. Younger people generally hew more leftist or progressive, or some combination thereof. But they also don't generally vote that much, and that's a problem. Older people tend to be much more conservative, tend to vote quite a bit. A lot of them don't have a lot else to do but vote, so it's not a big deal to them to go out. But students, assuming they pay attention to politics at all, a lot of the times, even if they want to vote, they'll forget, they don't know where to do, they forgot to register. There's all these little things that younger people, being inexperienced, aren't as familiar with, and so they're relatively more likely to end up not voting than not. That happened to me once. I got lost in a rainstorm the first time I tried to vote in a presidential election, and ended up in downtown Dallas. I actually ended up driving against traffic at one point. That was an adventure. So, being young and dumb, that's just part of growing up, but it also means less likely to vote. And as a result, youth are not a great part of any political coalition. It's not, unless there's something big going on. I remember the youth really turned out to vote against Bush in the 2008 presidential election. And yes, I know Bush was not running in that election. Didn't matter. I guarantee you, all of those people voting for Obama were not voting for Obama so much as they were voting against Bush. There was just that much Bush hate in the country at that time. If you didn't live through it, you don't know it. And trust me, it was a real thing. So anyway, what can you do to appeal? So the Democratic coalition, union workers, students, and then urban professionals, which was a shift they made in the 1970s in recognition that their traditional coalition was fracturing. The traditional Democratic coalition had been union workers, who at that time were much more powerful, and Southern Democrats, who were basically conservative Southern whites, who didn't want to vote for the Republican Party because A, Civil War, screw those people, and Lincoln. That's their attitude, not mine, just saying. Want to make that clear, because this is the internet. Also, Southern conservative whites were upset about, well, they wanted more government money. That's another thing. The South was and remains disproportionately the poorer part of the country, and so they generally ask for more support in the form of university money, military bases, blah, 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 all that kind of thing. So Southern conservative whites allied with Union labor basically in the North and Northeast, and that was a rock-solid political coalition for a long time. And it helped that the Democrats picked up the African Americans had voted for Republicans pretty consistently after the Civil War, up until the 1930s, when they kind of switched over, because the Republicans weren't really offering to give them much economic support in the Great Depression. The Democrats were, so that swung them. And that created an awesome coalition there that worked really well for a couple decades until it just fell apart in the 70s. The Southern whites were upset about the Civil Rights Movement. Opinions were shifting in the South. The South is getting more economic development, so they were becoming more economically conservative. So there was a shift towards the Republican Party there. And then, of course, students were the big thing, but union labor kind of started its long trend downwards at that point. Fewer and fewer workers in the United States were a part of unions, and what unions there were faced increasing opposition from increasingly powerful conservative forces in the country. So that coalition fell apart, and the Democrats responded by trying to pick up urban professionals, whom generally were more economically conservative, but were also generally socially liberal. And so the idea was, all right, let's take advantage of the 60s social revolution and try to attract those people away from the Republican Party and get them voting for us. And we'll run on a social liberal platform that encompasses some of the old economic liberalism, but it doesn't really matter because there's not enough voters for that anymore. So we won't ever actually implement a leftist economic program because they don't think it's a vote winner. Maybe that's changing now, but in the 80s and 90s, that seemed to be the case. It didn't look like leftist economic policies were good things to have in a political platform. So most parties, including leftist parties, not just in the United States, but in the broader developed world, shied away from them. Neoliberalism was very much the rule of the day in that period. So for the left, for the Democrats, the Democratic Party to appeal to rural voters, probably almost invariably they would have to tone down the social liberalism, because that's a major irritant for socially conservative rural folks. It makes urban professionals and urban liberals, especially socially liberal or urban liberals, are very alien to social conservative rural people. I mean, it's almost different worlds, and the degree of technological and economic dynamism and development that's happened over the past 30 years has widened that gap into a chasm. So there are some people who grow up in rural areas who come to urban areas, especially major metropolitan areas, and it's like a whole different country. It's just very different, and it can be very uncomfortable for them. It can be very hard to adapt to the different culture there, which is radically different from where they come from. So picking up those votes by being a little less socially liberal, that's one thing you can do. You could try to address the economic malaise in rural America. Rural parts of the United States, if not the broader developed world, are really, really hurting because of structural changes in the economy, have shifted economic activity away from small towns, even small cities, towards larger central cities. So a lot of those little factory towns that used to kind of exist on their own and support a lot of families and communities, a lot of those are gone now. And those areas are kind of the ones that are disproportionately hurt by economic changes that have occurred in that vein. And so trying to solve their problems would be a huge vote winner. I mean, even just trying. Trump didn't try to solve their issues. He just sounded like he did. He just made noises that sounded like he might be able to, at some point, to make a deal, as he said, that would magically somehow solve their problems. I don't think even most people who voted for him thought that was like a great platform. But here's the thing, nobody else was even talking about their problems. I mean, Democrats and even most Republicans were giving nothing but platitudes to these people. So Trump, for all of his ills, he was at least recognizing they were in deep shit. They had a lot of problems and would at least try to do something about it, at least promised at some point to do something about it. And I read on Fabius Maximus, a blog, one of many blogs. Again, I don't endorse what's on Fabius Maximus, but a blog I read to reiterate the traditional disclaimer that I have to use whenever I reference something. I don't endorse the contents, but I read on Fabius Maximus that Trump beating Clinton, or specifically Trump's platform beating Clinton's platform, was a classic example of something beating nothing. And if you're, in rural America, that makes a lot of sense. Trump promising something, however unlikely he may be to deliver on that, is more attractive and a better prospect than Clinton promising nothing and almost certainly delivering nothing. So trying to address their economic woes would be a step in and of itself in the right direction. Here's the problem with that approach, though. You're almost certain to fail because those economic problems are deeply rooted, and there are no real good solutions to them that I've heard yet. There are different things you can try to alleviate the symptoms, but structural changes in the economy almost invariably, marginalize and disproportionately negatively impact very particular populations of people. And those populations are very hard to compensate for the trouble that they go through. And you almost just have to wait for them to die off, because they invariably cause a lot of trouble while they're undergoing that economic malaise. There's a lot of instability in societies that not suffer, but go through these transitions. And while these people are suffering, naturally they want help. They ask their political system to do something for them. But when it's something this fundamental to life, as just the way the economy works, automation, digitization, all these kinds of things that are taking jobs away from those with high school educations and who need and want high school education level jobs. For those people, there's not much you can do for them in a modern economy like that. And I more than welcome anybody who knows better in chat to input on this, because I would love to hear some ideas in this vein. Anything would be interesting in that regard. So I would love to hear people's ideas on that. But as far as I know, there are no good solutions. So if the Democrats promise to fix these problems and get votes, they would win in the short term. They would get some votes in the short term, but eventually they would probably fail. And eventually that would be very disappointing. That's part of what killed the center-left in Europe. So many center-left parties said, we're not going to do neoliberalism anymore, but we're not going to make the changes that need to be made in order to actually address the fiscal deficits and the ongoing economic malaise in Europe, and a lot of European countries anyway. And so they promised to fix the problem, but they boxed themselves in. They said they wouldn't do anything that was like neoliberalism, but also that they would deepen the same kinds of reforms that were causing the problem. So they ended up failing to solve the problem, and then everybody turned on them because they just thought they were liars. You're just saying these things to get votes. Why should we trust you? Let's vote for Viktor Orban. I'm sure he can fix everything. Or vote for some other party of an ideology similar to that line of thinking. That's the danger with going this route to addressing the populist wave in Europe generally, if not also, and specifically rural America, and trying to get their votes. So Democrats should be cautious about that. Being less socially liberal is the safer thing to do, although it will almost certainly piss off, I'm sure, huge segments of their voter base, of their constituents. Beyond that, I don't know. It's tough because the Democratic Party, political polarization is so strongly rooted in the United States now. It's been a big part of the political landscape for about 30, 40 years that the Democrat and Republican parties have branded themselves. And amongst their supporters, those brands are very positive generally. But amongst their opponents, they're very negative. And I imagine it's going to be even more difficult than it would have been otherwise to try to convert people who have been voting consistently Republican, to convert, so to speak, to start voting Democrats, even though they have this very negative brand image of what the Democratic Party is. I know a lot of people in chat have been very much for a proportional voting system to address some of these problems, but I remain very skeptical about that. But I won't comment on that here because every time I do, I make an ass out of myself. My explanations in that vein have not been particularly good. So I'll hold my tongue there and save that for maybe a future podcast episode or something until I can read more about it and give you something more intelligent to say on that count.
Podcast, yeah.
Yeah, I am working on that. I have ideas, notes, and things. I've just been sidetracked. There's a lot of work to do and a lot of procrastinating to do, so that kind of gets in the way of things.
Yep.
So how are we doing on time?
We'll probably go for maybe another 5 minutes if you have another little point you wanted to address. I'm not sure if we have more questions.
No, we tapped out.
All right.
We blew through them all.
Sweet. Any final thoughts of stuff you thought that was interesting that you wanted to address?
The Communist Party of China is holding its plenum this month, I think. Or if not this month, then very soon. And it's basically just a big meetup of the Communist Party of China in which they kind of do a lot of political haggling and make a lot of decisions about the future course of public policy, as well as the future composition of the country's leadership. And this is a big deal here because this one in particular is a big deal because it's going to determine it's going to reveal basically the power of Xi Jinping, the current premier of China. He's easily the most powerful leader China has had for probably since Deng Xiaoping. And there's a lot of questions about whether Xi Jinping is going to consolidate power further than he already has, or if he's going to kind of stick to a lot of informal political norms that were established in the 1980s. He hasn't really broken a lot of those norms yet, but he's skewed dangerously close. But if he wants to maintain his hold on power, and specifically the hold on power by his cohort of political allies, he's going to have to break some norms now. Because the tradition is that you kind of pave the way for future leaders and give your other political networks, so to speak, room to have political power at these plenums. And so hypothetically, if there's a lot of political opponents, or at least maybe not, you can't tell if they're opponents, but if there are a lot of people who are not explicitly aligned with Xi Jinping getting positions of power after this plenum is over, or in this plenum rather, that would be a sign that Xi Jinping is toning things down, that he wants to kind of hold the line, maintain a lot of informal norms that have been established since the 80s, and that he's not going to make a full-fledged push for full power, so to speak. That would also mean that reform is less likely in China, since one of the barriers to reform in China is all of the political infighting. You don't see any political infighting in China because it's all done behind closed doors, but there's a lot of disagreement, and it manifests as inaction. If there isn't consensus or some agreement as far as future course, then generally the party just won't do anything. And China has been doing a lot of nothing over the past 15 years. Xi Jinping's reforms notwithstanding, he's been pushing more in the last couple years. But Hu Jintao's regime, for example, was just a whole lot of nothing. And that kind of gives you an idea of the lack of direction, the kind of aimlessness there is within the party. So if there's a lot of people that are not explicitly tied to Xi Jinping getting positions of power, that would be a sign that probably not a lot of reform, a lot of change coming to China over the next 10 years. But it also means there's probably not going to be a lot of political power. There's not going to be a heightened risk of black swan events that might come from a full-fledged push for power. On the other hand, if you see a lot of Xi Jinping allies getting power, and they are disproportionately represented in the Politburo, that would be a sign that Xi Jinping is making a full court press, that he's making a power play. And that could augur a lot of reform, the greater potential for a lot of change in China, either positive or negative, but it could also augur greater political instability in China. Whenever somebody makes a big power play like that, there's a risk that people will fight back, that a counter coalition will be made to try to temper your offensive, so to speak. And that could lead to problems in China. Who's to say how it'll manifest? It may happen and we'll never see it, or it may just explode utterly. You never can tell with opaque political systems. That's the trouble with them. You don't know what to expect. But that's something big to watch for. Nobody in Western media anyway talks a lot about China or Chinese politics, but China is a major driver of world history at this point. Even if they don't have a lot of military power around the world, the development of their economy has already had immense repercussions everywhere. And how they use that power going forward, which is going to grow over time, that's going to have an important bearing on the course of history going forward. So I think it's important in that regard to pay close attention to political developments in China, especially of this variety, one where this is a rare example of where you have something very specific in Chinese politics to point to and use as a measure of what's going to happen going forward. So this is the rare rock star, big event in Chinese political history.
I think it was one of the middle episodes that we have on the YouTube channel. Agent Smith may be somewhere between 4 through 7, but you focused a lot on the rise of China as a really big deal on the world stage, but especially in the West, it's something that's not really covered or focused on very much.
Yeah, unfortunately, that is the case. It's on the other side of the world. There hasn't been a lot of historical interaction there, at least not deep interaction, because of the vast cultural differences. So it's, in a way, China is kind of the last place on Earth that is really truly alien to Western culture. You know, Western civilization obviously just conquered the shit out of the Western Hemisphere, and it got deep into Africa, and it dominated in South Asia and Southeast Asia. Australia doesn't even bear mentioning. Obviously, that was thoroughly dominated. But then China is kind of the one place that was never really so dominated that it was thoroughly penetrated by Western culture, in part. Communism is actually a form of Western culture, so you could actually say China was westernized more than, say, India or other colonized peoples. Communism, in so much as it was able to dominate the political culture and then in turn dominate the social culture, was able to westernize China, one could argue, more so than any conservative colonial European could have ever dreamed.
A counterpoint,
But
though,
that,
would be the religious and spiritual culture of China as being very non-Western.
mhm, that's true. But that was also annihilated in the Cultural Revolution in large part.
Mm-hmm.
That's an example of that's something that a colonial government might want to do or would try to do, but might refrain from doing. For example, as was refrained from doing in India because it would have sparked a backlash. You can't annihilate the culture completely. They would just fight back. It would be a huge mess. They'd kick the colonialists out. It wouldn't work. But in China, it did work because it wasn't colonial Europeans. It was communist Chinese. That's not to say that China has lost huge tracts of its culture. Obviously, it still has a good deal of continuity there in that regard. But there's a lot of things in early 20th century communism, especially the brand that was used in China, influenced as it was by Bolsheviks, that is to say Russian communism, that had a lot of innate sort of subtle Europeanism, so to speak. There were a lot of little assumptions and little things kind of baked into it that were innately European. And those things got slipped into Chinese culture kind of without them realizing it. So somebody asked here, they know we may not have time to, yeah. So are our political parties pretty much stuck between a rock and a hard place in terms of attracting voters outside of their traditional bases? Yes, in the sense that their political leadership wants to broaden their voting bases or to change them, and they can't, either because of a lack of imagination or risk aversion or whatever. In that sense, they're experiencing a lot of difficulty trying to expand in that way. The real story is not there, though. The real story is at the underlying grassroots level. Even if the political parties themselves are not successfully expanding their popularity or attracting new voters, the voters themselves are actually realigning. People that are kind of redefining themselves and redefining their ideologies in ways that facilitate changing votes. It used to be that people in places like the Rust Belt, people that either work in factories or used to work in a factory, in those kind of old factory towns that have been abandoned, in places like that, they used to pretty consistently vote Democrat, even though the Democrats hadn't been able to really address the structural economic issues that were undermining their economies and their interests. For a long time, they'd still been voting Democrats, but because of those changes and because of the lack of delivery on those problems, they've been shifting more towards Republicans. And that's an example of a political realignment. I mean, really, part of the epochal change we're seeing across the world right now, in every developed country, almost every developed country anyway, is manifesting. The changes are manifesting as a major political realignment amongst political interest groups and ideologies in the developed world. So they're kind of redistributing themselves amongst the parties. So the parties themselves are struggling to attract voters, but the voters themselves are kind of doing it for them. That's kind of what you see with the Trump phenomena. You see these sort of nationalist Americans, high school education generally, but also a lot of other people as well. I don't want to just peg them as high school educated, but predominantly that's kind of the image that the data presents. A lot of high school educated American nationalists in the hinterland have shifted, regardless of their interest in unions or whatever, to the Republican Party because they were attracted by Trump's nationalist message. And so you may well see a shift in American politics from a socially progressive party versus socially conservative party to it being more of a nationalist party versus a liberal party. And I say liberal, I mean classical liberalism, as in, open political systems, lots of integration with other countries economically and politically, active in the foreign policy sphere, etc. And in a sense, that would actually be a return to norm. I think I've talked before about how a lot of the changes happening in the United States over the past few decades actually represent a reversion to mean. It's actually making the United States look a lot more like what it looked like before World War II. It's kind of reverting to form in a sense, in some ways. Obviously, you could debate and quibble about that. There are certainly some things that are different, but I think it's surprising how much the United States is coming to resemble in many ways pre-war United States, the pre-superpower of the United States, and that could be the form that this political realignment takes. So, the forces of history are deciding these things for our political parties, even as they are either too incompetent or too unimaginative to manage them themselves. So some final thoughts there.
Nice. Well, cool. Today's been a good session. Lots of solid questions. There were a couple more that kind of spilled over at the end, so save those for next week. I believe we will be on for next week. We might adjust it to a different day. I'll check in with you about that. We might visit Pact's family and be up there on Sunday. So tentative Agent Smith again next Sunday. But I've got my birthday coming up on Tuesday, so I'll be doing a bonus stream there. Thanks a lot for the support of Agent Smith during today's stream. He gets more
thank
than
you very
usual.
Much appreciated.
So awesome. And people who missed any of this, it'll be on YouTube probably by tomorrow. So thanks a lot again for coming on, and good to hear that there are some at least early brainstorming thoughts about a future podcast, as we all hope for.
Just got to finish the proofreading first.
Yep. Well, that sounds like good business in its own way.
In its own way.
Yep.
Could put it like that. Well, thank you for having me on. Much appreciated. Always fun.
Yep, keep it real, dude. See you around. Nice. Neuro Day. Bonus, what do we get? You get hangout time with